Hubarin ang takot sa iyong damdamin, ipamalas ang angking galing.
Tumayong mong tapang harapin ng buhay, yakapin ang tagumpay.
Tulungan ang kapwa't bigyang halaga, wag hatakin ng pababa.
Isipin wag sana ang sarili lang, pakisama't bayanihan.
Subukan nating isulong at ligawan ang magandang bukas.
Ikaw at ako magkasama tayo, salubungin ang kinabukasan.
Halina't hawakan ang aking kamay, sabay abutin natin ang tagumpay. Patuloy lang tayo sa pagpapanday, wala sa Diyos ang sandat at kamay.
Bukan natin isulong at ligawan ang magandang bukas. Ikaw at ako magkasama tayo, salubungin ang kinabukasan.
Sa ngalan po ng SCCA at lahat na nagsikap na ilunsad ang pagtatanghal ng Lapu-Lapu, ang dato ng Mactan, taos-puso pong pasasalamat sa inyong lahat.
Bayan ng Magiliw, lahing di pasisiil. Ladies and gentlemen, presenting the maiden production of the newly restored Metropolitan Theater, Lapu-Lapu, ang dato ng Mactan.
So kung titignan mo yung pagdating nila dito, talagang nangangailangan sila. Hapong-hapo, gutom na gutom, uhaw na uhaw. Kung hindi pinakain ng ating mga ninuno, yung mga namamatay na crony na Magellan, wala sana tayong pinag-uusapan na First Circumnavigation of the world, na achievement ng siyensya at ng sangkatauhan.
Binisita sila ng taga-Suluan ng Magellan Expedition and there were exchange gifts. Yun ang ngayon ang sineselebrate ng humanity in Humonhon.
Ang description ni Pigafetta, 1,500 na taga-Mactan coming from 3 sides. Talagang ginamitan ng talino at strategiya ng ating mga ninuno sina Magellan.
Ngayon, nagkakaroon tayo ng reorientation and refocusing ng ating kasaysayan, kung saan binabalikan natin ang ating kasaysayan sa lente o sa vista ng mga sarili nating mga manunulat at mga historiador.
Alab ng puso, sa dibdib ko'y buhay. Hindi sumusuko, sa hirap matlumbay. Sa mga manlulupi, hindi pasisi. Duyan ang magigiti, hindi papi. ay bati 500 taon ng daluyot yanig tayo bumabangon isang puso pa rin isang alap sa dilim iba't iba man ang mga bituin sa isang kalawakan magniningning magkahawak kamay sa lilim ng bughaw na langit
Mandirigmang Pilipino, dakila ang lahi ko. Bayaning Pilipino sa makabagong panahon.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our viewers around the world at sa lahat po ng mga Pilipino na nanonood sa atin ngayon dito sa Zoom at sa Facebook Live. And to everyone who's, all Filipinos who's watching us from all over the world as well as here in the Philippines. At magandang umaga po muli sa inyo lahat. It is now 9:06 a.m. Philippine Standard Time. Welcome to the inaugural session of the Philippine International Quincentennial Conference. Ako po si Joel Aldor from Grupo Kalinangan, and I'll be your moderator for Panel D of the PIQC with the theme, The Philippines Shaping the Quincentennial Discourse. Now, before we begin, we ask everyone to please stand for the singing of the Philippine National Anthem. All right, everyone, you may all be seated. Okay, again, welcome to panel B of the Philippine Quincentennial Conference. And we are currently live in more than 100 Facebook pages, primarily at the National Quincentennial Committee Facebook page, the Department of Foreign Affairs, and other foreign service posts, and the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, and the National Commission for Culture and the Arts Facebook pages, among many others. And we're also live at the via the YouTube channel of the Department of Foreign Affairs. Now, 2 days ago, we have seen the opening program of the Philippine International Quincentennial Conference and heard the close diplomatic relations between the Philippines, the Republic of Portugal, and the Kingdom of Spain, and how the Quincentennial brought our countries together closer still. And yesterday, we explored the Quincentennial from the context of our brother nations in the ASEAN, or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and from the perspective of the organizers of the various Quincentennial commemorations from Spain, Portugal, Guam, and also here at home in the Philippines. Now, all these papers, the messages and the statements from these sessions will form part of the proceedings of the PIQC, so that the next generation will be guided how the Philippines and the world commemorated the milestones associated with the first circumnavigation of the Earth. For our panel this morning, we have with us 4 leading scholars that have contributed to the deeper understanding that we have for the 2021 Quincentennial commemorations in the Philippines as it relates to the previous commemorations of the first circumnavigation of the world, to newly explored sources on our pre-colonial past, and to the Filipinos' role in the Quincentennial. Now, these are our 4 panel speakers this morning. We have Paulo Pinto, PhD from the Universidade Nova de Lisboa. His lecture will be The Philippine Pre-Hispanic Records in Portugal. He will be followed by Vernon Tutanes, PhD of the Rizal Library at Ateneo de Manila University, with his lecture titled The Trinidad H. Pardo de Tavera Collection and the 1921 4th Centenary of the Discovery of the Philippines. Then our third speaker will be Danilo M. Herona, PhD of Partido State University, with his lecture titled The Critical Role of the Philippines in the First Circumnavigation of the World. And finally, our fourth speaker, Professor Xiao Chua of De La Salle University, with his talk titled Quincentennial Commemoration as a Filipino Reflection. I encourage everyone, especially to those joining us on Zoom as well as on Facebook Live, to use the chat or the Q&A function to send your questions. And also for our audience on Facebook, you may post your questions in the comment section and our technical team will collate and forward them to our speakers, especially to our first speaker for this morning, since it's joining us all the way from Lisbon. It's already past 3 a.m. there in Portugal. So our speaker would appreciate if he can answer your questions right after his talk. So with that, let's start our first panel speaker. He's currently a researcher at CHAM, or the Center for the Humanities of the Universidade Nova de Lisboa in Portugal. He holds the master's degree in history on the Portuguese Age of Discovery and a PhD in historical sciences with a focus on Portuguese-Spanish relations in Asia during the 16th to 17th centuries. His main areas of study include early modern Southeast Asia, European presence in Asia from the 16th to the 18th century, and the Iberian overseas empires. To give us our first lecture titled The Philippine Pre-Hispanic Records in Portugal, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Paulo Jorge de Sousa Pinto. Bom dia, senor.
Hello, good morning. Good morning to Manila in the Philippines. Good evening here in Portugal. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. My warmest greetings here from Lisbon to my Filipino friends and all over the world. Just a little correction. My paper will be a little bit wider than the initial team suggested. It's basically something about the Portuguese sources, that some information that I think it will be useful for Filipino researchers and scholars and also for the general public. that I would like to share with you. Let me share here my PowerPoint screen. Are you okay? So I called it Portuguese Materials on the History of Early Modern Philippines, a glimpse, an overview on sources, archives, and recent projects. Of course, this is not exactly an academic presentation, an academic paper. It's something practical, informal. My apologies for this. It is my intention here, I think it would be much more useful to give you an overview of the relevance and the importance of the Portuguese documentation and sources and archives to the Philippine history. I decided to divide it into three main parts. The first one, an introduction, an intro, to provide some historical context of Portugal, Spain, Portuguese Asia, Spanish Philippines, in order to fully or better understand the features of the Portuguese sources and their relevance to Philippine history. Secondly, I will give you an overview, a general idea of the Portuguese documents, mentioning the main archives, the main published collections, and also a few chronicles. And basically to put a very simple question, why are Portuguese sources important? And finally, and most important part, I would like to focus on the current work we are developing now at my center at CHAM in a set of collaborative projects we gathered under the general name of Portugal-Philippines Connected Histories. And I will focus basically on two research projects. The first one called Documenta Filipina and another one called the Philippine History Retrieval Project, Portugal. Okay. So let's move into my introduction, general ideas. Well, this is basically directed, focused on the Filipino public. I don't know if you are aware of some of the details regarding the Portuguese and the Spanish and in Asia. Some general features and information, because one of the most important issues to take into consideration about the relevance of the Portuguese sources on the Philippines is precisely this historical context of Southeast Asia, mostly in the early modern age, namely the different shapes of the Portuguese and Spanish empires on that time and their respective evolution and their mutual relations between the Portuguese and the Spanish in this context. Just a few ideas. Well, the Portuguese had an empire in Asia. It was basically a maritime empire based on city ports, maritime trade routes, some fortresses, and some factories also, but it was not based on a territorial continental basis, unlike the Spanish for instance, in America. As you can see here in this map, you can see here a whole set of little dots. These are the Portuguese factories and fortresses in Western India. Well, in Southeast Asia and in the Far East, the scenario was quite different. The Portuguese only had mostly Malacca, here Ternate in the Moluccas, and later Ambon, and nothing else. They had then Macau and then a port in Nagasaki, but it was basically an informal empire and settlement and presence here in this region, unlike India. Well, of course, this region, there was an informal and imprecise line of demarcation that separated the Portuguese area of influence, if we may call it so, and the Spanish one, the line from the other side, in the other side of the world, of the famous line of Tordesillas here. Well, and it was this alleged line that was challenged by the Magellan expedition, and also the tensions that followed between the Portuguese and the Spanish. Well, the Spanish settled well in Cebu and later in Manila, and because of that, there were permanent tensions between them and the Portuguese settled in Malacca and here in the Moluccas. I'm talking, of course, in the late 16th century. The Portuguese were also in Macau and in Nagasaki in Japan, and they feared that the Spanish would use their base in the Philippines as a base of operations to try to penetrate in Asia, in China, in Japan, in continental Southeast Asia, and also, of course, in the Moluccas. And so there was a permanent suspicion between the Portuguese and the Spanish. Well, this was the initial scenario. Just to say an additional note, well, the Spanish Empire had its center in the Americas, in the New World. The Philippines were some sort of an extension of this territorial American empire. On the other side, the Portuguese had their base of operations, their headquarters in Goa, in India. So this region, Southeast Asia, was marginal to both empires, which made everything much more interesting for the historians nowadays. Okay, so this was the initial scenario in the 16th century, but then something happened in Europe that changed a little bit this sort of relations. It was a political event. Oops, sorry. Yes. Well, the Portuguese dynasty, the dynasty of Avish, ended in 1580. The young king Sebastian died in a battle in Morocco against the Muslims. Then he had no succession, and so it was his uncle that succeeded him in the throne, the old Cardinal Enrique, who died in 1580. And so there was no direct heir of the Portuguese throne. And so a dynastic crisis emerged, and the most strong candidate was the Spanish king, Philip II, the son of Charles V. Well, and so there was the crisis, and in 1581, the Cortes in the city of Tomar elected Philip II, Philip II, as king of Portugal. And so there was a new dynasty, and for 60 years, Spain and Portugal had the same king. Ironically, in Portugal, this is called the Período Filipino. So if some Filipinos come to Portugal and see something about the Período Filipino, is not unfortunately about the Philippines, but about these kings, three, Philip II, the third, and the fourth, who in Portugal were called the first, the second, and the third. Well, dynasty of the Habsburg or the Austrians. They ruled Portugal as a separate kingdom and a separate empire for 60 years. And so this had an impact in Asia. Basically, this is the scenario of Southeast Asia. Here are the most important, settlements or positions of the Portuguese, Malacca, Ternate, at this time, and then Macau and Nagasaki and Manila here. And so what happened is that the Spanish king, Philip I of Portugal, decided to keep these separate jurisdictions. And so, besides, although we had the same king, we had different and separate empires. And of course, this led to a process of tension for one side, but also of collaboration between the Portuguese in Malacca and Macau and the Spanish in Manila. Of course, there were different approaches of the Portuguese to the Spanish in China or in the Moluccas. In the Moluccas, they received well the Spanish at this time because Malacca was too far away and the military support from Manila was always welcome. But in Macau, they received very badly this in a very suspicious way the Spanish in Manila because they feared that they would use this common king now. We are both under the same rule to just penetrate in China and challenge and destroy the very lucrative and profitable trade the Portuguese had from Macau to Nagasaki. Okay, these are just the historical details, just to say that it was a special period of time when the Portuguese and the Spanish were at the same time allies because they shared the same king. But trade between the Portuguese positions and the Philippines was forbidden. It was illegal, but smuggling was very common, of course. There was also a missionary tension because the Augustinians and the Franciscans of the Spanish Philippines tried to penetrate in Macau and in Nagasaki, who were under the Jesuit influence. And so there was this tension. But at the same time, at the end of the 16th century, there was a closing between the two sides because of the common threat, the Dutch. And so there was an alliance, a military alliance and friendship clear between the Portuguese in Malacca and Macau with the Spanish in Manila against the Dutch. And so the Portuguese and the Spanish were initially rivals and now allies and friends against the common enemy, the Dutch and then the English. Well, but this only lasted until 1640. Because on December the 1st, there was a coup d'etat in Lisbon. The governor, the Spanish governor in Lisbon was deposed, and the people elected the Duke of Braganza as a new king against the Spanish, of course. They were considered as rebels by the Spanish. This is called in Portugal restoration of the independence of Portugal. And so, and the new king, John IV, was elected as a new dynasty and a new king. And so the Portuguese and the Spanish were now at war in Portugal, in Spain, in Europe, until 1668. And so suddenly the Portuguese, Spanish friends in Macau and Manila against the Dutch were now suddenly enemies. And so this lasted for several decades, and peace was finally signed in 1668. And then contacts and trade between mostly Macau and Timor and Makassar, the Portuguese there with Manila, was resumed and tensions were lowered and trade could be once again be made. So the Portuguese and the Spanish were rivals, then allies, then enemies, and finally trade partners in the late 17th century and also throughout the 18th century. Okay, this is the general scenario of the history because the documentation on the Portuguese sources reflect these tensions and these different moments. Okay, this is the introduction. Now let's move into the second part, saying something about the sources and the relevance of the Portuguese sources to the Philippine history. Now, here are some ideas, my personal opinion, what I say. Why are Portuguese sources important for the history of the Philippines? Well, in the early 16th century, it's quite easy to say because there are some information about the Philippines before the expedition of Legazpi and the following Spanish colonization. And so there are information about pre-colonial Philippines that are in the Portuguese sources. And so they are important because of this. Not only about the Philippines, but also about the Filipinos outside the Philippines, say, namely, what the Portuguese called the Lusões. I mentioned some information about the Lusões in Malacca. A trade community that existed there, and the Portuguese were in very good terms with them, and also some information about their social relevance, their trade networks, namely their connections with Brunei, with Borneo. There is also some confusion naming the Lusões from Borneo, for instance, and some confusion about Borneo, Brunei, and Lusões from the island of Luzon, most probably. Now, this in the early 16th century, but throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th century, there are a few information I would like to just point out that why I think the Portuguese sources may be important for the history of the Philippines. Well, they show the Philippines mostly, of course, Manila, through outside eyes, through external eyes, from the point of view of the Portuguese, how the Portuguese saw the Philippines and Spanish and their importance, regional, local, as rivals, as allies, and then as enemies, and also as trade partners. So it's an outside look perspective into mostly Manila and the Philippines. Then it is important, they are important also to show the Philippines as an Asian trade center, an Asian trade hub. The relations and the trade connections between the Philippines with the Portuguese settlements in other parts of Asia, namely the relations with Malacca, the Moluccas, and Ternate mostly. Macau, most important, Macau, the trade with Macau, very profitable. Then Nagasaki until 1640, and in a later period, Timor. There's also a dimension very important in the Portuguese sources, is the religious dimensions of both the Iberian empires in Asia, how the different religious orders collaborated and were rival. The Franciscans, the Jesuits, the Augustinians, the Dominicans, most of them Spanish, the Jesuits on the, say, the Portuguese side, let us call it this way, and their tension, permanent tension, and how they mixed with politics. Also, their respective strategies of these religious orders. As we know, it was a very important dimension in the 16th and the 17th century. Their networks, mostly the Jesuits, how they were able to, being strategical, trying to penetrate into China and Japan and also to Vietnam, and how this collided with local regional politics and international, Asian networks of trade. So, and also how this mixed with the so-called padroado, the right of the Portuguese to establish, to promote Christianity in their own domains in Asia, and how this was challenged in the 17th century first by the Franciscans trying to go into the Portuguese area, and later with the propaganda fide with the French and so. And so this is the dimension that the Portuguese sources clearly show and in their information. Okay. Now I would like to just, well, very quickly give you some information about Portuguese archives and sources. Primarily, well, the main Portuguese archives that are well known here are some of the most important in Lisbon. The Arquivo Nacional de Torre do Tombo. Here are the websites. The Arquivo Histórico Ultramarino, very important, and Biblioteca da Ajuda. These are the three most important, but also others with some documents and documentation also relevant, like the National Library, Biblioteca Nacional, and also the Academy of Sciences, Academia de Ciências de Lisboa. But there are other archives outside of Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, that have also some important collections of documents, like the library of Coimbra University in Coimbra, and also one of the libraries in Oporto, and the public library of Évora, that has an important collection of manuscripts, some of them very relevant for Far East and Macau, and with some information with the Philippines also. Now, this is something very typical, is showing the archives, but before the archives, something that must be taking attention to is the collection of documents already published. The first step to contact the Portuguese documents is starting to what is already published, because some of these documents, of course, are in the Arquivo de Torre do Tombo and in other archives. Here are some of the main collections of documents. The Cartas de Afonso de Albuquerque in the 19th century, and some collection of documents published mostly in the 50s and in the 60s of the 20th century that still are very useful nowadays as collection of published documentations. Also, but the most important chronicles of this period. Well, these are the most important. Duarte Barbosa, Tomé Pires, who wrote the famous Suma Oriental. I will mention this at the end of my presentation. And then João de Barros, Fernão Lopes de Castanheda, Gaspar Correia, António Galvão. These are some of the most important chronicles of the 16th century. Some of them are well translated into English versions, but others not. As far as I know, for instance, António Pinto Pereira is not translated into English, and that's a pity because it's a very important source. And mostly, Diogo do Couto, who is one of perhaps the most important chronicle, very long with several volumes, and still the only edition is from the 18th century. We are still waiting to have a new, fresh publication of this source. Now, let's move into another direction. I would like to say a few words about some recent work we have been involved here in CHAM, Centro de Humanidades, sorry, in a collaborative set of projects, activities, and editions we called Portugal Philippines Connected Histories. It is about a partnership that has been established since 2018, so 3 years ago, involving CHAM, involving the Philippine Embassy in Portugal, Ateneo de Manila University, and also NHCP, among other Filipino entities. Two of the main projects are about Portuguese sources and are both in their final stage to be finished and delivered very soon. just give me, sorry, give me just 1 minute. These are to try to show you very briefly. Okay, here, this is the website. We have, well, as you can see, the latest post is about this Quincentennial conference. I have some information about all the projects. Well, some research projects. One, I will talk about these two precisely. Also, seminars and lectures. The latest one was a couple of months ago involving CHAM and Ateneo de Manila in a huge conference called Contacts and Continuities. Also some books and editions that are under preparation now, events, well, some general information, and finally upcoming projects that we will develop in the following year. Well, one of them, an edition on the Portuguese cartography on the Philippines, the second one about the early accounts of the Philippines in early modern Europe, the first one coordinated by my good friend Miguel Rodrigues de Lourenço, this second one by Rui Manuel de Loureiro, and finally Portuguese, the first Portuguese in Portuguese language of José Rizal's Noli Me Tangere is something we are very proud of, and we would like to close this set of collaborative projects with this very important name in the history of the Philippines that is unknown in Portugal, and I think it's going to be a very good initiative and project. Let's go back to our sources and our projects. Basically, I'm talking about two projects, as I have mentioned. The first one is called, of course, this is just a sample, a very brief description. The first one is called Documenta Filipina. For those who attended the opening session Wednesday, the ambassador, Madam Ambassador Ana Celia Feria, she mentioned this Documenta Filipina is basically a research guide. It aims being a useful guide for Filipino historians and scholars in their research in Portuguese archives. It is a compilation of information about the Philippines from Portuguese archival documents in 3 Lisbon archives, the most important: Arquivo Nacional da Torre do Tom, Histórico Ultramarino, and Biblioteca da Ajuda. It comprises 1,457 documents, records in total, as the outcome of the research and examination of thousands of documents from dozens of collections in the 3 archives involved. The selected documents contain relevant, though often indirect information about the Philippines, and they are sorted in chronological order. A range of reference data is provided for each document, each record. Archive, call, document, author, place, date, summary, and keywords. Occasional observations or publication data are included when applicable. The time span of this whole set of documents extends from 1514 into 1832. This project took almost 2 years to complete because of the effects of the pandemic and the extended closing of libraries and archives into different occasions. It is now in its final stage of compilation, checking, and careful revision, and it should be ready and delivered until the end of the year. Here is a sample. Well, basically is this very simple, basic record mentioning the document, archive, number, a very brief summary of the theme focus mentioned in the document in an extensive list of records that should be a useful guide for Philippine researchers in their work here in Portugal. Okay, this is basically what Documenta Filipina is. Let's move on to the final project. The second project is called the Philippine History Retrieval Project, Portugal. Following an invitation from the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, CHAM has formed a group of scholars, researchers, and translators in order to prepare and undertake a project devoted to the compilation of information contained in early 16th century Portuguese chronicles and documents. So it is basically, and our intention is to make the main Portuguese sources on the Philippines available to Philippine readers. It is basically a selection of documents from the 16th century, a total of 68, some already published in Portuguese in old editions, some of them with errors we have discovered now, others still new and unpublished. These documents may be divided into 33 letters and memorials, 18 roteiros or roteiros, navigational guides with geographical information, and 17 parts of chronicles. Some of them I have already mentioned a few minutes ago. The working process of this project followed several steps. First, a reproduction or a photography, when applicable, to some manuscript in the archives. Then a transcription of the manuscripts in the original. Then the most difficult and most important step and phase, the translation into English. And we have a very good translation team, but it's a very tricky work because some of the expressions are not easy, and 16th century Portuguese sometimes is not an easy task. Then notes, annotations, giving brief explanations of the author and of each author and each document, context, names, and places. And finally, a careful revision, global and a careful revision of the text, and a final compilation. The working team on this project involves 12 researchers from CHAM and translators, and the project is closed now and in the final phase of revision, global revision. It will be delivered, read and delivered within 1 month, probably until November 15th. Okay. Finally, let's give you a sample of this project. Basically is this. This is the photographs, the reproduction of a manuscript. Here is blurred, the part that doesn't matter, and clearly readable, the part that the excerpt that is included in the project. And then for the same document, here a transcription in the Portuguese, and here the translation into English with some footnotes. Basically, this is what is done for most of the documents. And so this is something that is almost ready now. This is just a sample, of course. We will provide high resolution photographs or reproductions of the manuscripts and preparing the final outcome of the project. My last image is something that I mentioned at the start, is Suma Oriental, a little part of the Suma Oriental that is already included in this project, of course. Suma Oriental is a very important source for the whole Southeast Asia, mostly Malacca and other places, but also the trade communities in that city when the Portuguese took it. And it was published in Portuguese in 1978 for the first time, Fortunately, my good friend Rui Manuel de Loureiro made a new edition a couple of years ago in 2017, and this is a small part, except about the Lusões, about how Tomé Pires Filipe Malaca contacted with most probably the Filipinos, the community of Filipinos that was there. This is a description and how the Portuguese confused the inhabitant of the island with the island itself. And it is a small, brief description on how the Lusões live, what is their importance in Malacca, and how the Portuguese connected with them, and how they lived with other communities in the city. It's a very important source and a very important excerpt. And of course, this is included in our project that we will hope to have ready very briefly soon. Okay, this is what I had to say to you. I hope it will be useful. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thank you and obrigado, Senor Pinto, for your talk on the Portuguese sources of Philippine history. Wow, this is pretty interesting. We have heard how important these Portuguese sources are about the Lusões, or what we call the inhabitants from the Luzon area. We call them Filipino traders based outside of the Philippines, especially in the Portuguese settlements. This is a very interesting and very important talk because we now have a better understanding how other colonizers or empires are looking at the Philippines through their lenses, especially in the religious and their trading history. We have also seen a list of Portuguese archives based on different cities like Lisbon, Coimbra, Porto, and Evora. Also some of the rich collections of published documents, chronicles from various writers of the 16th century, as well as research guides like the Documenta Filipina. This is really very interesting for our local academics who would be very interested to dig into these Portuguese sources as additional sources for the research. So again, thank you very much and obrigado, Dr. Pinto. At this point, since he's coming with us from Lisbon, Dr. Pinto would like to entertain some of the questions posted on our Zoom chat, and we can take one or two. We have a question here from Mr. Lorenzo Hipólito. His question is, why did the King of Portugal did not believe on the Magellan's route? Do you consider it as a setback to Portugal's might as an exploring empire?
Thank you. Well, this question of the King of Portugal, and I think this is it's a common mistake. It's a misunderstanding, better saying. Actually, the King of Magellan did not show his project to the King of Portugal. I think this confusion is something mixing the Columbus project. When Columbus wanted to find Asia, he made his project to the Portuguese king. He was rejected and he went to Castile, to Spain. With Magellan, people tend to think it was the same, but it was not, because it didn't make sense for Magellan to present his project to the Portuguese king. It only made sense to present his project to the Spanish king, because the Portuguese were already in the Moluccas at that time. The Portuguese arrived there in 1512. And the Portuguese knew the route to the Moluccas and to the Indonesian archipelago. And so it didn't make any sense, the Magellan exposing and presenting his project to the Portuguese king. What we know and what we suspect is that Magellan should be convinced that the Moluccas were in the Spanish side. He was convinced because of his friend Francisco Serrão, who was in the Moluccas. And because of his calculations, he probably imagined that, well, possibly the Moluccas are in the Castilian Spanish side. And so he will expose his project to the one most interested in this, the King of Spain. That's a simple expression. Is something that I sometimes read something and listen. People saying, he presented his project to the Portuguese and he was rejected by the Portuguese king. Not his project. What we know is that probably we don't know exactly why, but they didn't get along very well. We don't know exactly why the king didn't like him. Possibly he was accused of being corrupt, and so Magellan, we don't know exactly the details, but there was some mutual hostility, and so he went to Spain. Can I see another question?
Yeah. Yes. There are some more questions. We have one, although this is an anonymous question. Did Portugal become a colony of Spain when it was ruled by a Spanish king for 60 years?
Well, not exactly. Well, in Portugal, our traditional view, our national traditional view is saying we were under Spanish rule, because all of the narrative after the Restauração, the restoration, is that the Spanish kings, the Philips, were not legal. They were usurping the Portuguese throne. And so throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, we said, well, we were under the Spanish brutal rule, and then we freed ourselves and took our independence back. But reality was much more complex than this, because mostly Philip II, he respected very strictly the separation of both countries. And Portugal gained more than lost being under the same king. Ironically, the Portuguese did not fear the competition from the Spanish, but the Spanish traders in Seville and also in America feared the Portuguese traders in Brazil and in Macau, because the Portuguese were better adapted to local practices, and they were stronger in terms of commerce. And so the Spanish feared more the Portuguese commercial weight than exactly from vice versa. But of course, there was a feeling at that time that we lost our king. We didn't have a Portuguese king. And in the 16th century, it was very important, a visible king, a national king, because it was the symbol of the country and of the nation. We were not a republic. And so I think that it is a very interesting period, precisely because we shared a common king. We were, as I said some minutes ago, we were and still are, and at a certain point, at the same time, friends, rivals, allies, and enemies of the Spanish. And so it's something that was kept throughout the centuries. Of course, now we are part of the same Europe, and things are quite different. But it's something that only emerged through the interest of the historians, this period, recently, because a century ago, we only studied the Portuguese real period. It was considered an obscure, a dark age period of Spanish oppression, of course. And so we turned our back to the Spanish. And only recently we and the Spanish historians became much more interested in this period because it's so rich, precisely because it's more complex.
Okay, thank you. We have one more question before we end this part of the panel. How significant is the expedition of Magellan to the Kingdom of Portugal during that period, even if it did not support the proposed voyage of Magellan? This question came from Lemuel Gonzaga.
Yes, I'm reading. Well, it was how significant. Well, it was disturbing for the King of Portugal. It was a problem because King Dom Manuel, the Portuguese king, he suspected that the Spanish sooner or later would try to go reach Asia through the other route, through the other side, and well, one of the reasons why the Portuguese king kept his viceroy in India, Afonso de Albuquerque, in a very early period, pushing him to please go to Malacca, go to discover Malacca, go to make a treaty with the local king, because he would suspect that the Spanish would try to reach Malacca, because the exact dimension of the Pacific was not known, of course, at that time. And so when he realized that one of his men with the Portuguese knowledge and practice in Asia, as Magellan had, were now at the service of his most famous and important friend and foe at the same time, it was quite disturbing, because it could jeopardize the Portuguese presence in Southeast Asia and the presence in the Moluccas. That's why the Portuguese immediately built a fortress in Ternate. And the strategy was to just stop the Spanish after Magellan, because it was a need for protect those exclusive trades of the clothes and so on. But fortunately for the Portuguese, the Spanish were unable to return to America. Only much more later with Urdaneta were the Spanish able to find the way around and the route back to America. And so things would extended until the late 16th century with Legazpi, but it could be possible to be immediately after Magellan a strong Spanish presence when the dispute of who the Moluccas belonged to was still very vivid. And of course, Charles, the Spanish king, was much more powerful than King Manuel. And so it was a challenge, but sorry.
It's a rather complicated answer. I mean, there's really no straightforward way to really understand how it could how the Magellan expedition is significant for the Portuguese. But either way, we are very elated to have you, especially with knowing about the Portuguese sources of Philippine history, and we thank you for sharing your time and joining us early in this morning, all the way there from Lisbon. And again, thank you, Dr. Paulo Pinto, for your lecture this morning.
Okay.
So, thank you. So, let's move on to the next panel speaker. Our next panel speaker is Director of the Ateneo de Manila University's Rizal Library and a professor of history from the same institution. He holds a PhD and a master's degree in information science from the University of Toronto and the University of the Philippines, respectively. He won the 2014 National Commission for Culture and the Arts Young Historians Prize for his work, A History of the Filipino History book. Today, he will join us for a lecture on the Trinidad H. Pardo de Tavera collection and the 1921 4th centenary of the discovery of the Philippines. So this is going to be another quite interesting one. So please welcome Dr. Vernon Tatanes.
Thank you, Joel. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. And can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, we do.
Okay, thank you. So as Joel said, the title of my presentation is the rather dry but precise Trinidad Pardo de Tavera collection and the 1921 4th centenary of the discovery of the Philippines. But before I continue, I would like to thank the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, specifically Ian Alfonso, for inviting me to be a speaker at this conference. And to talk about the Pardo de Tavera collection specifically. So I was given the title, and I thought I would give my own title. So I hope you don't mind that I gave it the title, The Remains of the Day. Why? Because I will essentially be talking about what remains, okay, from the Pardo de Tavera collection, as well as what remains from the 400th anniversary celebration in 1921. And so my outline is actually going to be in the style of the rest of my presentation. The outline is in the form of documents. So the first one is actually the introduction to the published papers of the 400th anniversary, or the 4th centenary, to make it easier. It's the centenary celebration, the centennial celebration, sorry. So this is actually it's the version that I downloaded. Okay, I'll explain that later. And by just looking at it, you can see that it's not a photo of the actual book. So this is the first part, the published version. And the second part of my presentation goes into the archives, where you will actually see, and I'm showing it right now, the original typewritten manuscript that was used so that the published version could be printed. So 2 parts. And then at the end, I will talk about what remains. Okay, so let's go on to the first part. The first part, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the 1921 celebration. So I'll show you, I'll give you an overview of what happened in 1921. Oh, but before that, I have to tell you the reason I am actually familiar with this particular publication is because in my dissertation, I actually featured Leandro Fernandez, and because of the background research that I did, I found this foreword from Teodoro Agoncillo, where he says, the first work on the subject of Filipino nationalism was written by Leandro Fernandez. And I'll show you that later. Okay. And that's why I actually had a copy of this even before I was asked to write about the 1921 celebration. But going forward, if you want to download your own copy, you can go to Biblioteca Digital Hispanica, with apologies to our Portuguese speaker. It's the Spanish National Library that has made this work available online. Okay. You can actually just go to the site and put Celebración and Magallanes in the search box, and you will reach this page. And if you click on View Work, you'll see, you'll get the entire book actually online. But this is a little difficult to manage online, especially with an internet connection that doesn't really work very well. So you can download it by clicking on that down arrow at the top. So I hope that's clear, and we can move forward. So I mean, you can actually download it now and look at it while I talk about it. So this is the title page, Celebración del Cuarto Centenario del Descubrimiento de Filipinas por Fernando de Magallanes. I don't know if I said that correctly, but that's how I know how to say it. And it's 1521 to 1921, so 400 years. I don't know if you notice, but at the bottom it says Manila Bureau of Printing 1921. So it's a government publication because it was also a government celebration. But if you look at it, especially this one that I blew up, it looks almost like a Xerox copy that was scanned. But I suspect it's actually scanned from the microfilm. And that's what they put up on the website of the National Library of Spain. Okay. Next, this is actually in the first part of the book. It's a photo of the carnival that was held in 1921. And again, it doesn't look like a photo because it was scanned from the microfilm. Here are pages from the book. And that, of course, is Magellan on the right. And on the left, in case you can't read it, it says Firma de Fernando de Magallanes. So that's the signature of Ferdinand Magellan. Okay. So I don't know who's in the audience right now, but one question I want you to think about is why it is that names are translated from Spanish to English, for example, and they change completely. Bakit nga kaya? Okay. So just a point for reflection. Why does Magallanes become Magellan, for example? Why could we not have just referred to him as Magallanes? Okay. So that's a point for reflection. If we have time, I'll go back to that at the end. Okay, next. Here's the table of contents. And so, yeah, I'll be, the first part is, this is the list of the members of the commission in charge of the celebration. And then I'll show you the introduction again. And then here are the speakers. There were 7 speakers speaking in person, 1 per day, from January 30 to February 5, 1921 at 10 a.m. If you'll notice, almost everyone has a title. It's Senor, Reverend, Professor, Academico. Academico, I don't know if that was a title, an actual title back then. And then, of course, Representante, Magistrado or Judge, I suspect. And of course, Dr. Pardo de Tavera. There was a song written for this. We only have the lyrics. I don't have the music by Senor Apostol. So what I'm doing right now is I'm showing and telling and hopefully getting you to reflect on why, for instance, all of the speakers were men, for example, 1. 2, what is it with the titles? Could they not just have said Conferencia del VR on Rubia? Okay. And for example, he's the only one who is called Senor or Mr. So that would have been Okay. But then we have, reverend, professor, academico, representante, magistrado, doctor. Is that something we still do? Of course, of course. Even in this conference, I am addressed as doctor, and if there were somebody else here who was an attorney or an engineer, I suspect his name would have been listed. His, okay, but probably there will be more her. Oh, okay. But engineer, that sort of thing. We encounter this all the time, even today. Diba? So how much have we changed since then? Think about that. Okay. Next. So this is the list of members of the commission. Later, I'll show you something else that will give a little more background to this list. And this is the introduction of Trinidad Pardo de Tavera to the collection of lectures. I just showed you the first, second, and third pages, which I was wondering when I was looking at this, why he wrote the introduction on February 16, more than a week after the last lecture was delivered. So I guess he did not deliver this introduction at the beginning of the celebration. Anyway, so the speakers, 7 speakers, this is what they look like. What do the photos from that period tell us today? They had a different style of taking photos, a different style of wearing clothes. The clothes were very different, definitely. I'll just show you. Okay, and if the titles are too small for you to read, I actually have the bigger titles here. So Onrubia spoke about Spain in 1519 on January 30. He was the first speaker. And Father Alge of the Manila Observatory spoke about navigation and meteorology during the trip of Magellan. And here is Leandro Fernandez, who spoke about the formation of Filipino nationality on February 1 in English. Okay. Here we have Epifanio de los Santos. Yes, okay, in case you've ever wondered what, Epifanio de los Santos of EDSA looks like, this is Epifanio de los Santos, who spoke about the fishing industry. And later I'll show you something that will make you think about why he spoke about the fishing industry then on February 2. Here we have, I guess he was Congressman Briones, who spoke about the trips through Acapulco, Cape of Good Hope, and the Suez Canal. I suspect he was not talking about, I haven't read the whole thing. I don't think he was talking about the Suez Canal in 1519. Okay. Anyway, the only American to speak was George Malcolm, who was then a justice of the Supreme Court. And again, we will go back to him later. And finally, we have Trinidad Pardo de Tavera, who just spoke plainly about the trip of Magellan. He was also, as the photo will show, the president of the commission in charge of the 4th centenary celebration. Okay. Other photos are, is this Columna de Magallanes. I think, yeah, well, it's in Manila, 1848. There's a letter from the Consul General of Spain, and these are the lyrics of the song that were written for this this celebration. Now, okay, there was also a list of illustrations, and when I was looking at this list of illustrations, I thought, wait, hindi ko yata nakita ito. Where was that map? So I actually downloaded the whole thing and I went all the way to the end and I said, I didn't see any map by Murillo Velarde. And that's where I will give you a tip, a librarian's tip. Okay. Because what is scanned is not necessarily complete. Okay. Sometimes you really have to go back to the printed book, if possible. And that makes you wonder, okay, with so much being scanned online and put online, and that we're using right now in the middle of this pandemic because we cannot go to the libraries, are there perhaps pages that were not scanned? And I'll explain how you can access this all later, but at the Rizal Library, we have a copy, and this is actually Pardo de Tavera's own copy of the book. And it has been preserved and it has been put in a box so that it is better preserved. But this is what it looks like. They put a call number on the book itself. This is Pardo's own binding. He had it bound himself. And this is the original title page, except there's also a card where it says compliment of the commission. So I don't know if that was how English was spoken at that point. Because today we would say compliments of the commission. So, there are certain things where you wonder, is this an error? Is that how they spoke in 1921? Another point for reflection. Okay. At the back of this book, okay, I don't know if you see it, but I've reduced the size of the photo, but there is a fold out map. And now you begin to suspect why this fold out map was not scanned with the entire book. Because I opened it up and it is the Murillo Velarde map. And it was probably hard to even put this in the book. Okay, so I actually saw another copy of this book and it did not have the map. So it's very possible that the copy that reached the National Library of Spain did not have a copy of the Murillo Velarde map, and that's why they did not scan what they did not have. Okay. Anyway, I also discovered that separate publications were made of each of the lectures. Okay, and this is Pardo de Tavera's copy of his own lecture, well, here's another tip from a librarian. Not everything that is published is necessarily correct. Okay, because the first thing I noticed about this was that why does it say Conferencia del 5 de Febrero de 1920? Okay, so forgive me for that. 1920 should be longer in Spanish, but it's hard to say. So I'll just say 1920, but it should have been 1921. But anyway, when you open the book, it actually says 1921. So there was a very important misprint on the cover page. And by the way, the cover page of the original publication, Celebración the whole title, okay, of the book, okay, would have been printed on this kind of paper. This is what the original cover would have looked like, except Pardo de Tavera basically had it removed because once you have it bound, you don't really need this kind of cover. Anyway, so it has the same Murillo Velarde map, but then there was this. Wow, I thought there's an addition. I don't know why, and it's very interesting. I did not open it up because the page was brittle and I did not want to destroy the page. And if you'll see, it actually says Fourth Centennial of the Discovery of the Philippines and the Circumnavigation of the World by Magellan, which makes me think it was actually printed. Well, the map was made for the lecture, but I guess it did not make it in time. And so it could only be included in this later publication of the specific lecture. And this is a close-up of the middle part where it shows Magellan reaching the Philippines. And that ends the first part. Now we move on to the second part. And I think I have about 15 minutes. I'll make this quick. Okay, so moving on to the second part, basically the archival part. I think I just have to say that most of what we do right now relies on published materials because we don't normally have access to the archival materials. Some of these archival materials have been digitized, but not all. And they're actually hard to digitize because, as I was saying earlier, if I spread out that map, it would have gotten torn. Okay. Now there are, there are a lot of things to consider. But yeah, I leave it at that for now. Next, if you'll remember, we had Father Alge as one of the speakers, and I thought I'd use him to introduce something else that is celebrating its 500th anniversary this year. Okay, but people don't always draw the connection because in 1521, okay, Saint Ignatius, who founded the Order of the Society of Jesus, to which Father Alge belongs, okay, was hit by a cannonball in 1521. And it was while he was recovering from that accident. Well, it wasn't really an accident. It was a wartime injury. While he was recovering, that he basically converted and started the journey that led him to found the Society of Jesus. And that founding led eventually to the establishment of Ateneo de Manila in the Philippines, whose most well-known alumnus is Jose Rizal, after whom the Rizal Library was named. Inside this building on the Katipunan campus of Ateneo de Manila University, you will find the Pardo de Tavera collection, which was donated in 1995 by the descendants of Trinidad Pardo de Tavera. I think this also gives you a sense of what invitations were like in 1995. Some of you are probably old enough to remember that this is how they did things then. Some of you may be too young. Okay. The following day, well, maybe a few days later, the event was featured in the Philippine Daily Inquirer. I suspect there is something wrong with the title. I suspect it should be Pardo de Tavera's Donate Book Collection. So why should there be an S? Because it was actually the Pardo de Tavera family that donated the book collection, but maybe the editor could not fit the word family, or thought that maybe an S would sound ungrammatical or wrong, or I don't know. But yeah, so it was featured, and some photos were published in a separate page. Yeah, so Mamita is the woman on the right wearing glasses. She is the granddaughter of Trinidad Pardo de Tavera. Okay. Anyway, later on, once the collection was organized, this is what it looked like. And if you'll notice, may mga drum, okay, dito sa kanan. So those drums are there because that's where Trinidad Pardo de Tavera hid the collection, his books, all the papers before World War II, and then he buried them in the ground, and that's how they were preserved. And that's why we have the collection today. Because otherwise, I don't know if you heard, practically everything was burned or lost or destroyed during World War II at the National Library and practically all of Manila. Next, okay, ito na. We're going into specific boxes of the archives. There's actually only one box. Okay, out of the thousands of books given by Trinidad Pardo de Tavera and more than 100 boxes like this of papers that he left behind, there's only one box devoted to the fourth centennial of the discovery of the Philippines. But, in fact, all the other materials, including the pamphlet I showed you earlier that contains the lecture of Pardo de Tavera, are actually, there are actually other boxes in which all of these things are distributed. I'll show you a few items later. Because when we're actually organizing these materials, we just follow the system of organization of the person who owned the items. We don't really reorganize everything because, this makes more sense. We follow the sense of the owners of the materials. So most of the materials I will show you now are from this box. Except this one. I'm sure there is a copy of the law creating the commission, but I couldn't find it, so I got this. I got this from CD Asia. So there was a law, and it was based on this law that then Governor General of the Philippines, Harrison, appointed the members of the commission. And at that point, the president of the commission was not Pardo de Tavera, it was Isauro Gabaldon. And just to let you know that you can't, you won't find everything at the Pardo de Tavera. This photo is actually from the Library of Congress. So earlier I showed you how to get something from the National Library of Spain. This photo of Isauro Gabaldon is from the Library of Congress, which has also digitized many photos of, he gave up the position of president because he was appointed resident representative of the Philippines in the United States. So he moved. And that was when Pardo de Tavera was appointed again by Governor General Harrison to replace him as president of the commission. Ayan. Okay. Next, going back to going back to the centennial celebration introduction, this is the full page of the half page I showed you earlier. And this one, okay, this one is from the first minutes of the meeting on October 1919. Something you should be thinking about, I don't know if you're aware of it, but there was a pandemic in 1918. By October 1919, it was not that big of a problem anymore. And that's why, the name of this is, it actually says Comisión para la Creación de la Exposición Internacional de Manila. So they were having an expo in 1919, 1 year after a pandemic that killed so many people. So mukhang mas mabilis yung recovery nila then. Okay. Next, we have the last meeting of the commission in January 25, 1921. Okay. On the carnival, in the carnival office in Luneta at 5:30 p.m. Okay, naka-indicate pa dyan yung oras. Okay. And then here on this page, this is the last page, we see Pardo de Tavera's signature, which you will be seeing again later for another, in relation with another document. Okay, something interesting, they actually received, aside from meetings, diba, parang they also received proposals, and somebody wanted to create an amphitheater with, that could accommodate 27,500 persons. They gave a budget. Okay, in this day and age of Excel, okay, can you imagine trying to type on a typewriter a budget like this? Okay. But wait, there's more. Can you imagine making a pie chart without using Excel? So this one, I think they used a compass and a ruler. Okay. And then I don't know how precise those slices are, but I suspect they are. Okay. Anyway, there's also a reply attached to it, which explains why these materials are in the box, because they were thinking that maybe the Magellan Centennial Commission would be willing to finance the undertaking. Yon. Okay. Next. Okay, I saw this pamphlet which seemed to be very interesting because it was part of the exposition. Okay, I suspect they gave this pamphlet away at a booth about the Limasawa exhibit, and very interesting, KS Limasawa. Okay, I hope some of you understand why I thought of sharing this, because of certain recent discussions, and this is the flip side. Anyway, so that's enough. What else? This is actually an agreement between the Magellan Commission and the Carnival Association. And the reason I showed you that signature earlier was that, so this agreement signed on January 25, 1921, between the Commission and the Carnival Association, was signed by Pardo de Tavera and George B. Vargas, okay, who was then Director General of the Carnival Association. I don't know if you are familiar with George B. Vargas, but there is a museum in UP named the Vargas Museum. And he did a lot more things after 1921 in different positions. And then there's this document, okay, just, where Pardo de Tavera says that the services called for in the contract with the association has been rendered in full, okay, to the complete satisfaction of the commission. Okay, samples of another box where, they are spread out all over the more than 100 boxes. So it will be actually difficult for a researcher to find everything without, okay. My best tip for you, if you go to an archive or a library, the best thing you can do is to ask a librarian. Yon. Okay. Because you can actually go through all the more than 100 boxes by yourself, but it will take forever. Okay. So the next best thing, ask a librarian, and the librarian will tell you how you can go about your search more quickly. Or give you the material you need directly. Next. So what's inside this? Okay, so there's this. It's another proposal. This one was for a fisheries exhibit. Yon. Okay. And I don't know which came first, the fisheries exhibit or Epifanio de los Santos's lecture on the fishing industry. But well, so these are examples of what could be part of that exhibit. But Pardo de Tavera actually approved this proposal. I don't know exactly how it looked or how big it was, but he approved it. Now this is another document from a different box, but I thought I'd include it because it's basically a reminder to Leandro Fernandez that his lecture is on February 1 at 10 a.m. at the Exposición dentro de Recinto del Carnaval. Okay, anyway, that eventually led to that lecture on February 1. And then, so going back, I was saying that, there are materials all over the place. And so the book on the left is actually in the shelves with the other books. This pamphlet on the right was actually part of inside another box in a folder where it was kept with other copies of this lecture. So kumbaga, hindi na pamigay ni Pardo de Tavera lahat ng kopya. And he ended up keeping something like 20 of them. We could probably give them away, but I don't think we will because archives basically collect and do not give away. Okay, next. Okay, so this is very interesting. When I saw this, they were actually giving away medallions of Magellan. I don't know if any of you have seen it. I put my key there on the right, on the left, so that you would have some idea how big this medallion is. So I thought it was interesting to include that. Now, okay, what else can you look at? You can look at microfilm. What did they say about the celebration in 1921? So I looked at the newspapers then. Okay, these newspapers are from the microfilm collection. They were not part of the Pardo de Tavera collection. So, you don't have to just go to the Pardo de Tavera collection. You can expand. If for example, you were, doing research on the 1921 celebration, you can expand your research to include other resources. and that includes microfilm. So it was front page news, one. But it was not the big news. And in fact, what did they say? 22 prizes will be awarded to winners in Carnival Parade. This is January 27. The next day, okay. So it's almost like publicity. Diba? Expect everything to be in readiness for opening of the carnival tomorrow. That's on January 28th. So that's the bigger version. And on January 29, the morning paper says, parade this afternoon will eclipse in beauty all former spectacles. So that's how they wrote headlines in 1921. Diba? I don't think they would write a headline like that in the Philippine Daily Inquirer or even Philippine Star today. And the blow up here shows you that there is a lecture on January 30 at 10 a.m. at the Exposition Building. It just says lecture. Okay. And I don't know if you've noticed, but so far, on the past 3 days, the headline does not mention Magellan at all. Think about that. We'll get back to that later. Okay. And then on January 30, Magellan is mentioned. But whose picture is on the front page? Her name is Carmen Prieto, Queen of the Magellan Carnival. So you get a sense of, okay, mukhang hindi si Magellan ang bida dito. Okay. It's called the Magellan Carnival, but it's not actually about Magellan. Okay. And again, there is a lecture at 10 a.m. on January 31. And that's actually Father Alge. Almost done. Just a few more. So this one is from February 3. So front page pa rin siya pero mas maliit. Diba? Hindi na siya nasa top. And supposedly there was a bomb found. But the following day, okay, so this one, essentially parang what the article says is para siyang fireworks na nadiskubre and actually, if it had exploded, nobody would have been harmed because it was really just. But I don't know if they're just explaining that so that people don't panic. Okay, but any firework that explodes is going to hit someone if it's in the wrong place. So they were just trying to calm the waters probably. And then, okay, here are a few ads that ran in the newspapers so that you can have a sense of what they considered important and what was worth promoting. Okay. And how they actually, advertised events before. And again, the lecture is an anonymous lecture. The coronation of Carmen I. Notice, Carmen I. I don't know if there was any Carmen II. Okay, or maybe it's a reference to her as being the first queen. And if you look at lecture, again, these are the schedules for February 1 and February 2. It just says lecture. Okay. Those ads were actually half page at the bottom. This one is a half page vertical. And so yan. First 4 days of Magallanes Carnival and Exposition have been a high success. And again here, may schedule, the lecture. And admission is 20 centavos. Okay, we're running out of time. Mabilis na lang to. On this particular day, February 3, it's strange. It didn't just say lecture. It said Democracy in the Philippines, Magellan to Dewey. Okay. And it was delivered by George Malcolm. Now, I was thinking, is there a significance to the fact that there were only 2 lecturers who spoke in English, but only one of them was American, and maybe that's why they gave the title here? We will never know for sure. But when I looked at the Spanish newspaper, okay, so the Spanish newspaper hardly ever put the carnival on the front page, but they did have the advertisement on the inside pages. And here you can see that the English title was translated into Spanish. Why? I don't have the answer. Something to think about. Okay, and then again, so later on, other ads. And if you'll notice, how did they spell tomorrow then and today? May dash. Bakit kaya? Anyway. And then here it says today without the dash. Last chance to enjoy the Grand Magallanes Carnival and Exposition. And so this is the last part. I'm just going to conclude by saying that, by asking, what remains? I spoke specifically of the 1921 celebration and the Pardo de Tavera collection. But what remains of what happened in 1521? Comparatively speaking, very little remains. We have primary sources from 1521, but if we look at all of the sources we have today, kakarampot yung natitira. And most of them are any of them even in the Philippines? I don't think so. In 1921, okay, we have published materials and we have archival documents at the Rizal Library and in other places in the Philippines and around the world, So if we wanted to, pwede nating buuin. And that's the reason I'm able to talk about this now. Now it's 2021. Okay. If we were to try and do the same thing, well, I'm sure somebody is keeping materials from this 2021 celebration at the National Historical Commission, at the DFA, at all the other agencies involved. People are keeping their own records. Mine are in my computer. Okay. And in my brain. Diba? So electronic resources as well as memories, including social media, etc. But think about it. In 2021, what will people think about what happened in 2021? Will they have records? If most of our records are electronic or in our hard drives, will they have access to that? Who will keep those materials? And definitely the memories will be gone. My memories especially will probably be in my Facebook account. But if I were from 2021, I'd be wondering, okay, usong-uso yung fake account ng 2021. How do I know that this Von Totanes on Facebook, assuming that they have a preserved copy of Facebook in 2121, how do I know that this Von Totanes is the Von Totanes I'm thinking about? Diba? Baka naman troll tong Von Totanes na to. Diba? So, I will end here and I hope you will think about what remains of our days here on Earth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Fontanes, for your lecture on the Trinidad H. Pardo de Tavera collection and the 1921 4th centenary of the discovery of the Philippines. That was a really sobering thought to end your lecture. Dr. Tutanes. So with this lecture, we've seen a particular source called La Celebración de Centenario, giving us a glimpse of how the Philippines celebrated the first circumnavigation of the Earth in 1921. And we've seen the lineup of talks, lectures, and even the speakers during those proceedings. Also, some of the local sources about laws establishing the Magellan Centennial Commission in 1921. Even, we've seen the minutes. And what's interesting about this lecture are how well planned their proposals and their implements are, as manifested by the new snippets that Dr. Tutanes had shown to us this morning. So for our Zoom and Facebook Live participants, please reserve your questions and post them later for the open forum towards the end of the panel. So we would like to request Dr. Tutanes and the succeeding speakers to kindly stay later for the open forum. So with that, we shall proceed to the third panel speaker. Our third panel speaker is a professor of history and the director of the Center for Partido Studies of the Partido State University in Camarines Sur. He obtained his PhD in Philippine Studies from the University of the Philippines and his master's degree in philosophy from the Ateneo de Manila University. He's a prolific author, has written a number of books on the history of the Bicol region and on the Spanish colonial records. So to share his lecture titled The Critical Role of the Philippines in the First Circumnavigation of the World, please welcome Dr. Danilo M. Herona.
Thank you very much, Joel, for the introduction. I'm going to talk about Magellan mainly because I did my work on the Magellan expedition. I wrote a book, Ferdinand Magellan, Armada de Maluco and the European Discovery of the Philippines, and did much of my work in the primary documents at the Archivo General de Indias and the Torre de Tombo in Portugal. And I take this opportunity to thank Ambassador Cookie Feria, who had invited me for a number of times in Lisbon to do lectures at the scholars and among the Filipino community there. And that, in a way, enriched much of my understanding of Magellan's expedition. Precisely, this is the reason why this discussion would focus on certain kind of revisions on certain information about Magellan, because we have a lot of confusions regarding the Magellan expedition. So there are actually three major aspects I would like to talk about this lecture. One would be the correcting certain misinformation or misimpressions, misconceptions on the Magellan expedition. As I said, I relied most on primary documents rather than the secondary sources because, as I said, a lot of misconceptions came out within the last 500 years because apparently we failed to consult the original documents of the expedition. Second, I would be focusing also on the critical role of the Philippines in the context of the circumnavigation. And finally, the role of the Philippines in the conquest, the Spanish conquest, colonization, of course, not only of the Philippines itself, but of course in Southeast Asia. So there are three things I would be dealing with in this particular lecture. Now, let me proceed to the topic. Setting the record straight on the expedition, the imperialist aims of the expedition. I think this is one of the critical issues in Magellan history for the last 500 years. Most of us were just schooled in the lessons that Magellan simply came to the Philippines. That's it. And why did he come to the Philippines? Some of the answers were given to us because of the spices. But what was really the reason why Magellan, the expedition was launched by Charles, and Magellan's serving as the commander of the expedition. One is, of course, to assert Spain's rightful claim to the assigned Western jurisdiction by the Papal Bull. That's one of the foremost reasons why the expedition was launched. You have to understand that, as earlier as discussed by my good friend, Dr. Paulo Pinto, Portugal was already on the edge of the Moluccas. In fact, by 1512, they were already encroaching in the Moluccas. Although their base was in Malacca, as they traveled eastward, a number of Portuguese sailors had already stumbled upon the Spice Islands, the Moluccas. And in a way, one of those who were in this expedition in 1511, 1512 was Fernão Magalhães, who is known in world history as Ferdinand Magellan. Magalhães was actually a sailor was serving under the Portuguese because he was Portuguese. And therefore, he had been to this to not only in Malacca, but he had been to the Spice Islands. And in fact, some Spanish royal chroniclers in the 16th century, the late 16th century, early 17th century, suspected that Magellan must have reached the Philippines as early as 1512, and that's the reason why he was in a way familiar with the Philippines long before he made a landfall in 1521. So it was there. The claim is that Spain was trying to cleanse its claim on the territory, which is of course the Spice Islands, because it falls on the westernmost edge, you might say, of the territory assigned by the so-called papal demarcation line. And quite interesting, the one responsible for asserting this claim on Southeast Asia, particularly on the Moluccas, was actually Ferdinand Magellan himself when he transferred his allegiance from Portugal to Spain. In fact, one of the audience actually asked the question, why did Magellan transfer earlier on to Dr. Pinto? And as he has answered that already. But then Magellan, as I said, transferred to Portugal, to Spain from Portugal. And he was the one who presented this idea that Spain should send an expedition to assert its claim on the Moluccas, as you will see later on in a certain document. The other reason is because Spain, during the time of Charles' sense of piety actually moved him to extend this Spanish Reconquista that had been already accomplished with the conquest of Granada in the later part of the 15th century. And because when the Spanish expedition of Columbus reached America, there were no Moors in America. And because of the readings, definitely, of Portuguese sources, including, of course, Magellan's own experience in Southeast Asia, especially as Dr. Pinto has pointed out, for example, the works of Duarte Barbosa and the works of Tony Perez, which already mentioned of the presence of Moors in Southeast Asia, in fact, heavily dominated by Moorish kings, in a way that fired the piety of Charles to colonize Southeast Asia, in particular, starting with the Spice Islands, because of the fact that this was a kind of a service to God to convert them to Christianity. The other reason was, of course, Charles' vision of universal Pacific monarchy. A number of European historians have actually emphasized the importance of this in the expedition of Magellan. That, of course, this is not generally mentioned in our history books. That one of the visions, one of the concerns of the expedition was to implement this, you might say, this ideology, this pious ideology of Charles' universal Pacific monarchy. Of course, it's not original to Charles. It was actually the one who conceived of this was one of his advisors, the Italian Mercurino Gattinara, who believed that signs of Charles' ascension to the Spanish throne indicate that God had assigned him a special mission to unify the world under the auspices of Catholic Spain, and it was going to bring about certain justice into the global sphere. Not only that it will convert to Christianity the world, but it also will reign under the mantle of justice. And I think anybody who's familiar with the 16th century history would know that it coincides also with the idea of Bartolome de las Casas. In fact, Bartolome de las Casas was among the consultants of Charles V. Bartolome de las Casas was actually one of those who approved, one of those who sat in the panel that approved the proposal of Ferdinand Magellan to embark on the expedition to the Spiceria. Therefore, the expedition, contrary to most of what we have always thought, was actually intending not to the Philippines. Although there, as I said, there are certain claims that Magellan was already familiar with the Philippines because of the claim of Argensola, who was a royal chronicler, that the expedition that Magellan had actually stumbled on the Philippines at one time during the journey to the Moluccas of the Portuguese. We don't really know whether it was really true, but that was only the claim of Leonardo Argensola, a royal chronicler. But definitely, the destination of the expedition was not bound for the Philippines. That's generally that's the reason some Filipinos apparently accuse Magellan of being a colonizer, because they thought it's essentially to the Philippines that the expedition was actually sent. Not necessarily. The expedition was very, very clear in the original documents at the Archivo General de Indias that it was bound for the Moluccas, the Spiceria, or the Maluku. That's the reason why the expedition was called in the official documents of the Casa de Contratación as the Armada de Maluku, or they refer to the Armada a la Spiceria, the Spice Islands. So it's not intended to the Philippines. The name Philippines was never meant. Of course, it was not yet actually conceived of, nor probably any indications in the volumes of documents kept in the archives of Seville did not give any hint on any scholar that it was going to clusters of islands as we now call the Philippines. It was very, very clear that the expedition was bound for the Moluccas. It was also, hence the aim of the Magellan expedition was colonization. Colonization because if you examine the cargo, there are substantial documents. When I was doing research at the Archivo General de Indias, it's quite fascinating to see the tremendous volumes of documents which provide us specific details on the Magellan expedition, which we have not been familiar with for the last probably 300 years or 400 years. But then there are substantial documents in the archives which yielded tremendous information to us. That one thing is very clear, that it was not bound for the Philippines, that it was not actually that it was actually intended to colonize the Moluccas. What was the document? What were the information that suggests to us that it was bound? It was actually intending to colonize, not only to discover, as the Spanish word used was descubrimiento, but as I said, if you study the term descubrimiento in the 16th century, it is a very, very highly nuanced term. That's the reason why people thought that when you use discovery, and in the book I used the word discovery of the Philippines, a number of people reacted to that because they said, how can there be a discovery when there were already people residing in the Philippines, the Chinese were coming here? I said in the 16th century, the word descubrimiento or para descubrir and this is generally terms used in the official documents of Charles and of the members of the Casa de Contratación, the word descubrimiento carries a special meaning, which if you translate that in contemporary times, in the present 21st language, I think you will miss the main point of the 16th century world. The term para descubrir and descubrimiento in the 16th century does not only mean finding a certain place. They always attach the term colonizing. So they generally associate the word discovery not with a thing, but with a land, with a territory, and with a territory that they intended eventually to colonize, to subject them to their colonial rule. And this is very, very evident in the cargo of the expedition. As I said, if you look at the documents in Seville, you will find them very, very interesting details on the amount of oil they carried, how many wine they carried with them. In fact, quite surprisingly to most of us, we thought that it's a very, very austere expedition. That's not true. The wine that they carried were tremendous. And in fact, they were carrying not only a wine distilled in a particular region, but they carried the wine bought from the Jerez de Frontera, which in the 16th century was already a very, very renowned wine maker region in Spain. And it says there in the cargo alone, it shows that they were carrying substantial amount of provisions. And the provision says the food and all these things that they would be needing amounted or allocated for 2 years. Imagine, the expedition was not given an allocation of food for several months. Because if you travel from Spain at the time to America, they were familiar with that. They've been traveling for a long time in this particular place. It would only take you a month or so to reach America from Spain. But computing that with this uncertainty of the distance beyond America, probably if they were only thinking of a provision to last for a journey, they would probably carry a provision for 3 or 4 months. But the expedition of Magellan was carrying provisions for 2 years. For 2 years, very, very specific in the cargo manifest and in the letters of Charles V to Magellan and to the member of the crew, that they were assigned a provision that would last for 2 years. And that's the reason why, if you look at the passenger manifest, the king was very, very insistent that Magellan should provide the exact number of the crew. And in fact, the king allocated allowed only 235 or so. I think that's the exact number, 235 members of the expedition. The reason is because he was allocating, based on the number of the crew of the expedition, the food that they would carry to last for 2 years. In fact, every day they would be given in the instructions of Charles, because there were series of exchanges of notes and decrees issued by Charles to Magellan and to the Casa de Contratación in dealing with the provisions that the expedition carried. It says there that they would only be allowed 235 because the allocation for food for 2 years would be based on that particular number. And that probably one of the reasons why Magellan's the expedition suffered tremendous hunger was not only because it was delayed in South America, but apparently Magellan added additional crew which were not officially registered in the manifest of the expedition. Now, Magellan added more Portuguese, and they were, and this is not actually mentioned much in our history, they were also included in the expedition a number of what they called desterrados. Desterrados actually at the time were actually prisoners. The reason why they put on prisoners in the expedition is because they were the first ones to make a landfall on a strange territory, which they expected to be met with certain hostilities. And therefore, it's not the Spaniards, it's not the crew who will be endangering their lives, but it's the criminals who were, after all, were suffering from punishment for the crime they committed. That's the reason why in the instructions of Charles, Charles issued 70 instructions to Magellan before the expedition left. It's very, very clear that they said, okay, when you enter a territory, you should first send these terados and accompanied by a certain interpreter to talk to the natives of the settlement. So the point is, it was intended to stay in the Moluccas because of the provisions that it carried, which is supposed to last for 2 years. Then it also tells us that it's not actually, contrary to most of what people thought, that it's intended to circumnavigate the world, that is supposed to be a scientific expedition. That's not actually true. Nowhere can you find in any document that it talks about circumnavigation, that it talks about a scientific research to know the world. It's essentially meant to colonize. Then, but what is the how would they colonize the Spice Islands? They would resort to diplomacy. I think the Magellan expedition is the first experiment of Spain to the use of diplomacy, apparently affected by the ideas, the Pacific ideas, the altruistic ideas of Bartolome de las Casas and the Dominican theologians and reformists in South America. It was intended, it was supposed to make use of peaceful means, to exhaust more peaceful means rather than the employment of violence, that they learned a lesson from South America, that if you use violence, it breeds also greater violence. And apparently because of the complaints and the doctrine of Bartolome de las Casas, which is of course very, very influential, as I said, in the approval of the Magellan expedition, then they began to use diplomacy rather than force. And this is very, very clear in the cargo, again, of the expedition. If you look at the amount of cargo of the expedition, a large portion of that were classified as the divas, meaning to say giveaway. So it carries clothing, carries bells, knives, intended to be given away to the natives that they will encounter in this territory. Therefore, aside from giveaways, it has to make use of trade. And that's precisely another purpose of the expedition. Not only that the Magellan expedition will be using commerce as a form of diplomacy, but it's also one of the purposes of the expedition to profit from the spice trades, which earlier on had been monopolized by the Portuguese. And therefore, though it is intending to colonize, it's not intending to conquer. And as you look at the cargo again of the weaponry, they were not meant to be used for a more sustained warfare. Apparently, although there were cannons in the expedition, they were only meant to protect them, but not necessarily as a form of aggression. And even the crew of the expedition, if you look at the biography, because the expedition contains a lot of information on the family background and even the personal background of the member of the crew, you seldom encounter or certain very, very few information seem to provide us a hint that the crew of the Magellan expedition were veteran soldiers, so to speak. And in fact, as you'll notice, even Magellan himself was not the typical soldier that we knew. When he joined the expedition, he was actually limping. He was not the typical guy, the typical knight that we always conjured up in our imagination. He was short and he was limping because one of his knees was actually shattered in the battle in North Africa. So, and many of another thing that provide us a hint that it was not intended to use force is that the number of the members of the crew were very, very young boys. In fact, there was a young boy the youngest, I think, is about 6 years old, which we thought all of them were matured people. No, they were teenagers and there were young boys, probably 6 or 10 young boys, meaning to say about from 6 years old to about 12 years old, and the rest were actually 17, 18, 20 years old. So it was intending this to be clarified because much of the information we got were actually confusions and of course very, very unreliable, very, very, you might say, informations which have not been verified by archival documents. Okay. Let me now proceed to the next. This is a document from the Archivo General de Indias. It says the Relación del Coste de la Armada de las 5 naos que van al descubrimiento de las especerías. So the report of the cost of the armada of the 5 ships that is going to be part of this Armada de Maluco, which is bound for the de la Especeria. So it says here Especeria. So anyway, just to show you that this is an example of the document in the Archivo General de Indias on the Magellan expedition. There tremendous. A number of them, many of them have already been placed on the internet, but there's still substantial documents in the archive. I think for a historian, it's a different tale when you just read on the digital sources and touching the original documents which Magellan himself and the crew of the expedition had written. It's a different experience. I think no amount of expenses could compensate in touching these original documents. The other evidence that the expedition was bound to the Moluccas was in the memorial sent by Magellan to Charles, which says there that it was sent few weeks, or in fact few days, because the expedition left in September 1519, and it says there that that Magellan was sending this memorial to Charles, giving him a description of the destination of the expedition. It was clear that he was bound for the islands of Maluku, the Spice Islands, and he gave details on this particular territory. So there is no question about this, that Magellan was actually going to the Moluccas and not in other clusters of islands which we now call the Philippines. Now, the crucial role of the Philippines as a gateway to the circumnavigation, a critical role, as Ian Alfonso said in my topic, that we have to emphasize the critical role of the Philippines as a gateway in the circumnavigation. One thing that we have to acknowledge is the fact that the Philippines is in a way a savior to the Magellan expedition. You have to understand that the Magellan expedition had been detained in South America because of the mutinies that Magellan experienced from the Spanish hidalgos. And even before the expedition left in Sanlúcar de Barrameda, Magellan already heard from his father-in-law that there was a certain mutiny that is brewing up before the expedition. And when they reached South America, it erupted. And therefore, it delayed the expedition tremendously, therefore taking away substantial amount of provisions that could have been used in the so-called trans-Pacific voyage. So when they were already on the high seas towards the Philippines, the Pacific Ocean, they were already hungry. The biscuits had turned, the biscuchos, as they call it in the Spanish language, because it's translated as biscuits. But in the 16th century, the word used in the cargo was biscucho, meaning to say very hard biscuit, because it lasts for a long journey. And they were already rotten the water had turned very, very foul, and according to Pigapetta, as we know it from the Pigapetta chronicles, they have to plug their nose to avoid smelling the terrible smell of the water. So when they reached, of course, Samar, especially when they landed in Humonhon, the people of Suwan provided them food, and it spared them from certain death out of hunger and out of sickness, which we generally associate with scurvy. And that particular reason that the Philippines spared them from certain death. So the Filipinos who encountered them were very, very hospitable. They provided them food, and because they were communicating with each other through Enrique de Malacca. Again, this is another confusion in Philippine history. Many historians thought that Enrique was speaking in Visayan. That's why he was under. That's not actually true. It was very, very clear that Enrique was speaking in a certain form of Malay language, and the natives of the Visayas could understand Malay, especially those who belong to the aristocratic families, the chieftains, because they've been traveling, they've been engaging in trade, and the Philippines at the time was no longer isolated, as Dr. Pinto has pointed out in the works of Tommy Perez. There was already a community of the Lozones in the Malacca, and therefore they could understand the language of the Malay world. So that's one thing. The provisions, the natives of the Philippines provided them tremendous food that spared them from certain death out of hunger and out of disease. It also provided them information, very, very vital in the 16th century, especially among sailors, because there in Samar and in Cebu, they learned not only of the vastness of the Southeast Asian territory. It enabled them to get a hold of informations on how, even on where were they and how far were they to the Spice Islands. That was their intended destination. So it's there that they got substantial information on the vastness of the territory of the Philippines. That's the reason why there were some speculations that actually Magellan was already, in a way, in love with Cebu at the time, because apparently, as one of the crew at the time wrote his own account of the expedition. It's not very much familiar to most of us because it's not yet translated to English. Hines de Mapra, in fact, said that Magellan seemed to have been in love with Cebu and with certain islands in that area. The reason is because in the contract between Charles and Magellan, Magellan would receive 2 islands beyond the 6 islands that he would discover, and the 2 islands would now belong to him. And apparently Magellan was entertaining that when they returned and reported to Charles, he would probably beg Charles to give him Cebu, this particular island, or other clusters of islands, which because of the wealth that the island was laden with, and also because of the high civilization of the Cebuanos at the time. So he got information of the insular geography of the Philippines and also of the proximate islands, which were actually his intended target, the Spaceria, the Spice Islands. It also enabled him to get connections. In fact, in Cebu and in other parts, there were actually sailors, there were merchants, Thais and Chinese, which enabled him to get connected to a larger, as I said, world in Southeast Asia, the Chinese in particular, and because of the fame of the Chinese civilization, which Magellan definitely must have read in Tommy Perez or even in Duarte Barbosa, who wrote, Libri Duarte Barbosa, wrote about a book on Southeast Asia in 1515. And so Magellan could have learned from them, and now when he is in the Philippines, he must have confirmed certain informations that were actually written in this famous Portuguese works of Duarte Barbosa and Tommy Perez. Quite interestingly to know is that Duarte Barbosa is the author of this libro. Duarte Barbosa talks about the 1515 book, talks about Southeast Asia. It's quite interesting because there was another Duarte Barbosa who joined the Magellan expedition, who was said to be a brother-in-law of Magellan because he was the brother of Beatriz, the wife of Magellan. Or in some documents, it says he was actually a nephew of Beatriz, and therefore a relative of Magellan, not actually a brother, but relative, and so of Beatriz. So it's quite interesting to note that in this particular instance, probably if it is true that Duarte Barbosa was the one who authored this whole libro published in 1515, then Duarte had already could elaborate on the informations on the experiences in Cebu and in Samar about Southeast Asia, and therefore must have enabled Magellan to connect the knowledge that he had in Cebu and Samar on the Spice Islands and other clusters of islands in Southeast Asia. And that's the reason why the Philippines is in a way became metaphorically a gateway to the circumnavigation. Had it not been for the Philippines, probably the expedition would have most of the crew would have perished. But because of the Philippines, many had been spared, and therefore were able to proceed with the expedition. Although unfortunately, one of the ship had been captured in the Portuguese territory in the Spice Islands. Only 18 were able to return to Seville. Just to give you an idea as how far was the extent of the territory that Magellan had to travel from the Stretcho de Magallanes in South America to the Philippines. It gave us tremendous information. How, as you will notice, this is it. You will know they have to cross the Pacific Ocean in some way, and in that particular respect, it explains why, despite the abundance of resources that the expedition carried, they would have to suffer eventual hunger. And here, the Philippines and the cluster of island, the Moluccas, it says here, shows to us the proximity of the Philippines to these their other territories, and therefore became the springboard for the eventual journey of the Magellan expedition to the Moluccas and eventually to return to Spain. Now, as we said, that it was because of the Philippines that the Philippines served as the gateway to the circumnavigation of the world. The reason is because with the Philippines and a few mileage of journey to the Spice Islands, their intended target, Magellan would easily find its way back to Spain, because if it could not find a different route, it could not travel back from the route that he had taken from the Americas to the Philippines. It could simply proceed to the traditional route that they have always been familiar, and he was familiar with this tradition. He had been traveling there. From Portugal to the Philippines or to Malacca, the so-called Portuguese East, and because of the Philippines, that's you might say the last geographic link to the Moluccas and to the eventual return to Spain through the so-called the circumnavigation of the world. The Philippines therefore was very, very crucial in the successful circumnavigation of the world. But other than the role of the Philippines in the celebrated circumnavigation, of course, which is the major highlight of the European celebration, the circumnavigation. And I think should add also that even in the circumnavigation, it's not only because of the Philippines, but it's also an Asian who played critical role to the return of the expedition, to finding the route from South America to the Philippines and even probably to the Moluccas, because in fact it was this guy who was used by Magellan as a witness when he presented his proposal that the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, belong to Spain, and that Spain should take advantage of really asserting its authority, its control over the territory, because of the fact that Portugal was actually aiming at conquering the Spice Islands, which Magellan said it actually belongs to Your Majesty and King Charles. In fact, in that particular document of Magellan's memorial to Charles, I did not include that, the last part there. It in a way says Magellan was actually telling Charles that I'm telling you these things to Your Majesty because if ever I died, at least you know already what's going on, because Portugal was actually aiming at securing control of that particular territory. So Magellan was actually was certain, and this was actually the major reason why eventually Charles was persuaded to send the expedition, because the need to assert their control of the Spice Islands. And as I said, one of the witnesses presented by Magellan, which in a way persuaded the counselors, the advisors of Charles, was Enrique de Malacca, a slave of Magellan, was a native of Malacca. And of course, many Filipino historians were debating whether he was a Cebuano or a Marino, but it's very, very clear in the Testamento, the last will and testament of Magellan, which he composed before the expedition left Spain, that he indicated Enrique de Malacca was actually a Malacca. He got him when he was about 17 years old after the Battle of Malacca, probably a war booty. And he brought them to Lisbon. Apparently, Magellan was already thinking that this guy would be useful for an expedition, this time which would no longer be under the Portuguese but under Spain. So he made use of him as an evidence to Charles and to the council of Charles that there is a certain territory laden with treasure, with spices, but which does not belong to Portugal but to Spain, and that's the Spice Islands. And of course, there's another native. It's not very, very much prominent in world history, but there is another native from Sumatra whom Magellan brought along during the meeting with the counselors of Charles. And she was supposed to be a woman who is very, very knowledgeable with the geography of Southeast Asia and the languages of Southeast Asia. And they were slaves of Magellan. So Magellan did not only have one slave, Enrique, but there was another slave woman she brought along, which she used to convince Charles of the need to colonize the Spice Islands. But as I said, other than the critical role of the Philippines in the circumnavigation, it was also critical in the, of course, in the Spanish interest to secure control of Southeast Asia. And Magellan's expedition was largely the one of the outcomes of the Magellan expedition was the conquest of the Philippines, because it introduced Spain to the resources of Southeast Asia, particularly the Philippines, and therefore awakened the appetite of the Spaniards for conquering Southeast Asia. And as we notice, subsequent expeditions were sent because they could not control the Spice Islands anymore, because later on, because of the empeño, because it was eventually sold, the territorial right, you might say the theoretical rights of Spain to the Spice Islands was eventually sold by Charles to King Emmanuel, and therefore it was no longer supposed to be. There was already a certain kind of a waiver on the part of Charles for a claim to the Spice Islands. Then the best place for them that is left for them to establish their base in Southeast Asia was the Philippines. And in this particular respect, they sent series of expeditions to the Philippines, the Loaiza, the Saavedra expedition, and in fact, in 1543, there was another major expedition, the Roy Lopez de Villalobos expedition, which is very, very clear, the clear indications that this time the expedition that Spain was now determined to establish their foothold in the Philippines. The reason is because the Roy Lopez de Villalobos was carrying missionaries, Augustinian missionaries, at least 4 or 5 Augustinian missionaries, meaning to say they were intending to evangelize the Philippines. Contrary to what we have always been taught, that the Magellan expedition did not carry missionaries. There were only 3 secular priests, but they were actually chaplains of the expedition, but not intended to evangelize. The subsequent expeditions in the 1543 Roy Lopez de Villalobos expedition was definitely intending to evangelize the Philippines. But of course, it resulted in tremendous failure. It only converted 1 native, a dying child, but other than that, it could not carry any, could not claim any might say, significant accomplishment. The other thing is because the Philippines became, because of the Legazpi expedition. Of course, the 1565 expedition was the definitive effort of Spain to colonize the Philippines. And in the 1565 expedition, it's very, very clear that it was now evangelizing the Philippines because of the Augustinians, but not only the Philippines. There were very, very clear indications that they were intending to go beyond the Philippines. As you notice, as you read in the works of, in the writings of Diego de Herrera, of Martin Berada, that they were not actually keen so much on staying in the Philippines, but their main interest was, of course, to go beyond the Philippines, particularly targeting China and Japan. And if you look at the map, this in the 1660s, there were actually 4 cities that the Spaniards in the Philippines have created. We have Cebu, we have here Cebu, we have Nueva Cáceres, we have Manila, and we have Nueva Segovia. If you will notice, they established their base in Cebu for what reason? To most of us people, we thought, most of the historians thought that, okay, they established their base in Cebu because they were familiar with Cebu because of the series of expeditions starting with Magellan. Yeah, but there's another reason. Cebu is very, very close to the Moluccas. And Spain still entertained the thought that they can still secure Moluccas. But of course, it became a fait accompli in 1580 when there was a so-called Iberian unification. Spain and Portugal were united. But prior to that, in the 1560s and above and beyond, they were still interested in securing this particular territory. And therefore, the most strategic base would be Cebu. Because one document during the Legazpi expedition says, if you travel from Cebu, it only takes about 4 or 5 days to reach the Moluccas. And therefore, because of the strategic location of Cebu, Moluccas, it shows that Moluccas was still a part of the interest of Spain. And if you look at the reason also why eventually they transferred from Cebu to Manila, aside from the fact that it was besieged in 1569 by General Pereira, the Portuguese, but there could be another reason why eventually Legazpi was persuaded to transfer from Cebu to Manila. Because Manila is very, very is comparatively closer to China and Japan compared with Cebu. And then in 1582, the Legazpi, the remnants of the Legazpi group eventually settled to Nueva Segovia because Nueva Segovia is at the tip of the Philippines because they were interested in going to Macau, going to China, and going to Japan. In fact, there was a document which specifically mentions of this. The Governor General at the time was worried because Franciscan, and Paulo Pinto had mentioned this earlier, that there were Franciscan was actually a Portuguese who was here in the Philippines, slipped off from Manila, proceeded to Nueva Segovia because he was interested in converting China and Japan. And this worried the Spaniards later on in the Philippines because of the possible backlash of this movement in the Philippines. But this is to point out to you that the Magellan expedition laid the groundwork in the long run for the eventual desire of Spain to secure control of the not only of the Philippines but of Southeast Asia in general. So let me end this discussion this way. Thank you very much. Okay. Just a final note, this is a document of Andres de Ordaneta, which informed them that they can access the Philippines by way of this particular, by certain reasons, despite the fact that it was supposed to be under the Portuguese already. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Danilo Herona. And thank you for your lecture on the critical role of the Philippines in the first circumnavigation of the world. We've learned how about the motivations and aims of the Magellan expedition. It is really crucial to understand how the concept of cultural diplomacy, not using force or violence, how it became key to align with the Pacific ideals, which aided the colonization, the eventual colonization of the Spanish territories in the Pacific in 1565. Also, how the Philippines became a great aid and help to the Magellan expedition, to the various provisions that the Filipinos provided to the Magellan fleet, the informations about how they're going to connect to the rest of the islands and connection to the Asia-Pacific network that extends beyond Southeast Asia. So again, for our Zoom and Facebook Live participants, please reserve your questions and post them later for the open forum towards the end of the panel. So we request again the speakers to kindly stay for the open forum later. So thank you again, Dr. Herona. Finally, let's introduce our fourth speaker for this morning. He is an assistant professorial lecturer in history at the De La Salle University in Manila. He's currently a PhD candidate in anthropology, and he obtained his bachelor's and master's degrees in history from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He is actively working as a public historian and served as co-author of the books Bonifacio, Ang Unang Pangulo, and Bayani Biographies, Andres Bonifacio, among a number of academic papers and articles. He is also a columnist with the regular column Shout Time in Abante and also with the Manila Times. His talk this morning is titled Quincentennial Commemoration as a Filipino Reflection. So please welcome, without further ado, we know him already, but we're very glad to have him again, Professor Michael Charleston Xiao Chua. Good morning, sa'yo.
Thank you to our friend in our common love for heritage, Joel, and also to my co-panelists, especially Dr. Vernon Totanes and Dr. Danilo Herona, whom I respect so much. Makasaysayang araw po sa inyong lahat, historic day to the world. I thank the National Quincentennial Committee, or the NQC, and the Department of Foreign Affairs for the trust and for inviting me to be one of the speakers at the inaugural session of the Philippine International Quincentennial Conference, or the PIQC, the largest historical academic conference in the country to date, joining about 100 Filipino and foreign scholars, diplomats, officials, artists, and scientists to deliver lectures in 36 panels. However, the views in this paper are mine and mine alone in my personal capacity as a public historian, and does not in any way represent the NQC, to which I am not part of, and the institutions that I am affiliated to. I will be talking about the quincentennial commemorations in the Philippines. From here on, the QCP as a sort of a self-reflection that we did together as a nation. Commemorations as public history are useless if we don't get anything from them. Of course, we honor our ancestors and our heroes through them, but they are dead and we'll never know about it. Yet, we honor the dead to give life to the living. Meaning, in rekindling the lessons of the past and the examples of our ancestors, we give sense and honor, or we give a sense of honor and identity to ourselves and give meaning to our present earthly existence. Call me an essentialist, but meaning-making is a given. Critical historian Renato Constantino once wrote that the past must be usable. And just like what Italian historian Benedetto Croce stated, all history is contemporary history. I repeat, all history is contemporary history. Which means we do not research to flesh out an accurate, we do not research to flesh out, or we do not only research to flesh out an accurate past. But we don't study the past, or rather, we do research to flesh out an accurate past. But we don't study the past for the past's sake. Rather, we study the past always in the lens of what is usable for us in the present, or to explain why things are in the present. The ability to create stories and meaning that binds us to cooperate and have affinity with each other is what Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari wrote as one of the reasons why human beings thrive on Earth in comparison to other species. Hence, it is meet that we should continue to make meaning of our stories so we can survive together as a people and as a nation. Our stories inspire us to have meaning in our existence, which in turn fuel our drive to achieve something in our everyday lives. Many question the Quincentennial or the QCT as a commemoration of colonialism. Although the true start of the Spanish conquest will begin 40 years after the victory of Lapu-Lapu, the Magellan-Elcano expedition mapped the Philippines for future colonial conquests, as our former speakers had said, and it would introduce Christianity, which later became a tool of that exact colonialism. Many more were confused how we can celebrate both the first circumnavigation of the Armada de Maluco and the victory at Mactan that killed its leader. These are not invalid observations and may result to furtherance of colonial mentality if the commemorations were unguided. Public historian Carmen Guerrero Nakpil once asked, and I quote, "What if Magellan had not come to the Philippines? It is too late to speculate on the possibility of our having escaped the long paradoxical Spanish colonization with its strange combination of hideous cruelty, humane and beneficent policies, and incredible corruption and conservatism. It was too late even on that morning in March, more than 4 centuries ago, when a small bearded Portuguese mariner stood on the deck of his wooden ship and glimpsed through the mists of the Pacific the blue mountains of Sama." Unquote. From the onset of the QCP, the historians collaborating and working with the NQC has always insisted that the events of the 500 years or the events 500 years ago can be viewed not in the lens and the benefit of those aboard the European carracks, but of the maritime people on the shores, ergo, the Filipino people. We cannot change what happened in the past, but we sure can change how we view them, and in the process, how we also view ourselves. And so, with the numerous events projects, and educational fora, these are just some of the things that came out about us in the light of the events of 1521 and our commemoration of it. 1. Filipinos are hospitable. Magiliw. Our adeptness to entertaining foreigners can only be understood in the context of our 1,000-year history of maritime trade and our concept of humanity and pakikipagkapwa-tao, seeing the self in the other. This is the reason why our ancestors from what is now Giwan, Eastern Samar, fed the famished, thirsty, and dying crew of the expedition when they arrived on these islands on March 16, 1521. Without these contexts, we can fall to the shallow misconceptions that it is because we have the tendency to be docile vis-a-vis foreigners and subsequently because of our colonial mentality that we are magiliw. If we did not show pakikipagkapwa-tao in Giwan, I am sure the expedition continued to fade away and we will not be talking about this achievement of science and humankind. This belies what colonial history has always told us, that we were discovered by Magellan in the literal sense of the word. This is the number one thing the QCP wants to demolish. By using often the illustrations and the symbolisms of the 1593 Boxer Codex, we have offered a visual way of imagining our ancestors, especially the skilled Bagani with many batek or tattoos. That's why we call them Batikan. Through the humanity in Giwan, we can say instead of Magellan discovering us, that we discovered Magellan. But food historian Feliz Prudente Santa Maria instead proposed that in 1521, Filipinos and Spaniards actually discovered each other. The QCP was intended to be our tourism peg for 2021 if the pandemic did not happen. Yet, we also saw the cooperation of both Spaniards, Portuguese, and Filipino scholars and diplomats in contributing research and meaning-making to our complicated history, like what's happening now in the PIQC. A sort of scholarly bayanihan. But however we say it, we have emphasized with the QCP that the greatest resource of the Filipino nation are its people and our pakikipagkapwa-tao. Goodness towards your fellow mabuting kalooban or goodness towards your fellow or mabuting kalooban that brings well-being and peace or kaginawaan and kapayapaan at katiwasayan. We have shown the same humanity and pagmamahal sa kapayapaan to the Jews fleeing the Holocaust or to the White Russians fleeing communist persecution in China and brought them, of all places, in Giwan, Eastern Samar, site of the 1521 humanity. For the boat people from Vietnam fleeing conflict, not because we are a weak people, but because we know how to give despite of the things we lack. Number 2, Filipinos have a creative spirit, malikhain. Our ancestors from 1521 expressed their faith, worldview, and valor through their tattoos, through their burial practices, through their marine vessels. We usually practice war only with just causes, and as the warriors of Mactan showed in their battle with Magellan, we can defeat a formidable enemy using our innate skills and strategy. It is the creative spirit that we show as we continue to express our culture and being through our artists, through our scientists, through our freedom fighters who use creative resistance as we face the many challenges thrown to us by history. The various entries in the Quincentennial Art Competition and the Lapu-Lapu Monument Design Contest are a testament to that creative spirit. Number 3, Filipinos are victorious, matagumpay. Many times, we commemorate more our defeats, like the battle at Pinaglabanan and the fall of Bataan. True enough, our continuing struggle for true liberation is hard and painful. But in carrying the spirit of Lapu-Lapu, whose first victory against the Spaniards inspired our national heroes like Rizal, Ponce, Jacinto, and Aguinaldo, the QCP made us also emphasize how we won the revolution in 1898 and defeated Spanish colonialism after 300 years to give birth to the Filipino nation, and how our guerrillas won the war for us against the Japanese invaders during the Pacific War in 1945. We also remember the victory and valor of our troops during the Korean War and those that keep the peace in Mindanao. With our love of country and fellow men, we are reminded that we shall overcome whatever challenges we are facing. 4. Filipinos have a dynamic culture. Our ancestors are not uto-uto. It is a fact that Christianity, which was introduced in 1521 with the bequeathing of the Santo Niño, became a tool of the colonizers to strengthen their hold in the islands. This was not being brushed aside by the QCP as debates and discussions about the implications of 1521 to our enslavement flourished, especially around the date this year that Yoyoy sang on March 16. But the QCP emphasized how our ancestors had agency in appropriating the new religion as a way of continuing their old cultures. And not only did they create a new, vibrant and colorful expression of our pananampalataya to God, as seen through the Sinulog dance and the pamamasan of the Nazareno devotees, but also strengthened the Filipinos throughout their tumultuous history and actually inspired revolts and actions to stand up for the oppressed. We cannot cancel ourselves in rejecting what majority of Filipinos hold important. Filipino Christianity is therefore a victory of our culture. Five, Filipinos love politics. The QCP emphasized that Magellan, far from being influential to the lives of the ordinary Cebuanos in 1521 as was once thought, became a mere victim of the political struggle between Humabon and Lapu-Lapu. I once wrote how I see Humabon now, not as a subservient actor, but as an adept politician, the quintessential Filipino politician, like the ones that we have today. Also, it may have been an honest mistake, but one senator's erroneous claim during D-Day of the QCP last April 27, that Lapu-Lapu was a Tausug who came from Mindanao, was consistent to the political strategy of the present dispensation. What one colleague and friend calls the Visminization of history. Just as they appropriated the histories of Balanghiga and Buddha into their narrative. Just the same as what the Marcoses did for Ilocos during their reign, when they proliferated the Biag de Lamang throughout the country, the same time he was putting more Ilocanos in the armed services. Small steps in strengthening political bastions which may prove useful in the future. The QCP in itself raged in the midst of historical distortion and misinformation as a pretext to the 2022 presidential elections. On the other hand, environmental activists also used the QCP as a platform to highlight environmental issues such as the quarrying near the site of the successful commemoration of the first landing of Magellan. Also, the libel case against the panel of quote-unquote poor historians who were only tasked by the NQC to know about the facts of a certain local event in 1521 demonstrated the lengths at which people will take to advance their point of view of history. A special mention should be given to historian attorney Saul for Attorney Sol Ofilenia Jr. for defending them from this assault to scholars who are only doing their job. Filipinos love using history for their politics. Always has been. But this is not to say that the QCP became a mere propaganda tool of the state. Far from it. To its credit, the NQC allowed and engaged cultural workers of various political persuasions, even critics of the government, and focused primarily on historical talastasan with a clear political agenda to push for a Filipino viewpoint of history which fosters love of country against or to discredit, to push for a Filipino viewpoint of history which fosters love of country against a discredited but still prevalent colonial perspective, insecurity, and national inferiority complex. 6. Filipinos love to eat. Last April, during the climax of the QCP, Feliz Prudente Santa Maria's book, Pigafetta's Philippine Picnic, was launched, which told us of the Magellan expedition in the point of view of food. How is that? Here we learned our ancestors used food and wine to welcome visitors, cement friendships, and show pakikipagkapwa-tao. It reminds us of how our ancestors give food to the needy in times of distress, in our bayanihan, how we celebrate important days with our fiesta, and how we share our grief and pakikiramay in eating. The QCP showed us that Cebuanos know how to throw a party, just like Humapon. The pandemic did not stop the province, especially Lapu-Lapu City, being the ground zero of the QCP or the epicenter of the QCP, in throwing a feast worthy of the 500 years. 7. Filipinos are flexible and resilient. I was aware of the many gargantuan plans prepared to commemorate this once-in-a-half-a-millennium event since 2018. The pandemic may have botched the QCP since March 2020, since a lot of its budget were reverted to mitigating the COVID-19 crisis. But despite throwing out many of the planned events, the NQC were able to act quickly, and by April 2020 had begun the webinars it has become famous for. Through Zoom and the very active NQC Facebook page, more people were able to participate in the QCP. The number of events initiated and coordinated by the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, or NHCP, the Secretariat of the NQC, were staggering, despite the small size of its secretariat. This is real public history and real inclusivity. Many people should be thanked, but mainly the national government officials and agencies who gave support to the QCP, the local officials who gave their cooperation throughout the country, the private sector for their interest, the teachers for echoing the QCP to their students, and most especially, NHCP Chair Rene R. Escalante, the captain of the ship who is seeing the QCP through, and my good friend Ian Christopher Alfonso, the Secretariat Supervisor, who never stopped getting ideas for the QCP, just like how Richard Carpenter was for the Carpenters. 8. And finally, Filipinos are heroic. Bayani. In the end, the QCP emphasized what was obvious throughout Philippine history, as our theme song states, Bagani, ating lahi. We see this selfless service, or wani, the root word of bayani, through our teachers, overseas Filipinos, and our frontliners during the pandemic. The QCP was much a salute to them, as it is a salute to our culture. Again, because of the QCP, we are made aware or more aware that Filipinos are hospitable or magiliw. We have a creative spirit or malikhain, are victorious or matagumpay. We have a dynamic culture. We love politics, love to eat, are flexible and resilient, and are heroic. Magad. Not since the Philippine Centennial did we have a most comprehensive commemoration which made us remember so much of our past. In fact, the 1998 Philippine Centennial only emphasized the birth of the nation, but the QCP, in talking about our ancestors, was able to bring out in their spirit many other instances in our history of victory and humanity that may not have seen the light of day. The QCP also tried to be inclusive. Since in following the route that Magellan and Elcano took, we go beyond our usual narratives from Mactan to also include the people from Palawan and Mindanao, especially the Sultanates and the Moros. In the narrative of the First Circumnavigation that changed the world. But more than that, in emphasizing our faith, crafts, and maritime culture that Pigafetta wrote about in the very first European account of our culture, we see our commonalities and diversity because we all live in the Austronesian world. And we are again reminded in the midst of regionalism and political division that the basis of our nationhood and unity can only be our culture and history. And as we tell the world the collective spirit of our ancestors in the context of the QCP, kagitingan, pananampalataya, pakikipagkapwa, pakikiramay, pagiging masayahin, bayanihan, pagiging mapayapa, and pagiging malikhain, we realize that it is also the spirit that we showed the world during the 1986 People Power Revolution, which we call Diwang EDSA, when Filipinos, soldiers and civilians finally refused to stop killing each other and instead show love to each other despite our differences. This is also the spirit we continue to show as our caregivers heal the world in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the NQC Facebook page, someone commented about why we are having this Quincentennial International Conference and why we are talking about 1521 when we should be talking about the 2022 elections. He said, and quote, "No urgency for history now," unquote. We as a people seldom care about history. That is why many of us do not realize how great we are as a people as we wallow in self-disrespect and inferiority and not learn from the mistakes of the past. How will we succeed if we keep on being divided? How can we succeed if we keep on hurting and insulting each other? Victory and humanity? Walang tagumpay kung walang pakikipagkapwa-tao. Wartime President Jose P. Laurel once said, and I quote, "We must unite, love one another, stop killing one another, because only the Filipinos can love Filipinos," unquote. The QCP also edified historians and public history in the continuing survival of the nation. As according to the historian's prayer, which was read in the opening ceremonies of this international conference, and I quote, "Help us become a bridge of understanding between the academe and the people, and make us learn the lessons of the past, so we could create solutions to our present problems toward attaining a better future. Despite the gifts that you have given us, may we stay humble and see our work as a way of serving our students, our readers, our publics. Yet, may we see ourselves as bearers of true enlightenment and justice, not enablers of darkness and ignorance. May the way we tell our stories of our past be relevant to our people, that they may learn something from it. May we bring history closer to the people, all for your glory, all for your greater glory, and for the nation that you have given us. Amen." And unquote. Historytellers are like the babaylan of our ancestors. When they chant their meaningful stories or salaysay na may saysay, the bayan realize that they have, or the bayan realizes that they have one past and one future together. The QCP theme, Victory and Humanity, reminds us even of what kind of Philippines or what kind of leader do we want to have after the next elections. Will he or she be a lapu-lapu who will show fortitude in the midst of our maritime disputes? Will he or she be a bayani who will give selfless service without expecting anything in return, who will not enrich their kin? Instead of calling it datu leadership, I would like to propose to look at pamumunong bagani, the protector of life, well-being, and honor of the people. Buhay, ginhawa, at tangal. In the midst of the narrative of hate, division, and violence all around us, the QCP is a breather, a refreshing reflection, to see ourselves in front of the magic mirror called history. An opportunity to look back as we look forward. To become a bagani begins with a decision to love our country. Love is shown in pakikipagkapwa-tao, which will lead to cooperation, bayanihan, which will ensure our kaginhawaan and the survival of the nation in the next 500 years and beyond. To the world, we say, our part in the First Circumnavigation story tells them, if you come in peace or in need, we will show our humanity and pakikipagkapwa-tao. But if you meddle in our sovereignty, however hard, however long, we will fight until we attain victory. The Quincentennial is a celebration not of colonialism or of anything else, but it is a celebration of who we are and what we must become sa makabagong panahon. Isang mamamayan ng mga bagani, umiibig, nakikipagkapwa-tao, at nagtatagumpay. Daghang salamat sa inyong tanan. Maya Paldo Kekongan, Kabalen.
Wow, thank you very much, Professor Xiao Chua. That was a very, very empowering talk about the Quincentennial commemoration as a Filipino reflection. So through his talk, Xiao Chua tries to make this celebration of the Quincentennial as a personal reflection, being a Filipino. No? He emphasized on how our historians and academics who are participating in this Quincentennial attempts to put light on the maritime lives of the Filipino people, and therefore correcting various misconceptions that have endured for a very long time about us Filipinos, and how the concept of the pakikipagkapwa or humanity of the Filipinos, especially those Filipinos in G1, who became a turning point of the Armada de las Moluccas. He also explained to us the 7 main Filipino values fostered in 1521. Of course, being hospitable, being creative, victorious, culturally dynamic, loves politics, loves to eat, and being flexible and resilient, and finally, being heroic. There are actually 8 of them. All of these 8 Filipino values still prevalent for all of us Filipinos today. Sabi nga ni, may nag-chat dito, sabi ni Rainier Margallo, gusto ko nang kumain pero di ako makaalis kasi ang sarap pakinig kay Professor Xiao. That was a really good one. And all right, thank you again, Professor Xiao. At this point, for the next 15 minutes, we will now open the floor to questions and comments from our audience. So our Zoom attendees may use the chat or the Q&A function to send their questions. Also for our audience on Facebook, you may post your questions in the comment section and our technical team will collate and forward them to our speakers. So we have quite a few already at the Q&A portion. I would like to call the attention of, well, this is an anonymous question, but this is directed to Dr. Von Totanes. Dr. Von, as a historian, what are your thoughts on just having references mostly made by Western male historians or archivists that talk about history, especially with the Philippines, or its people are included? That's the first question. Also, why do you think of Filipino children getting educated about its country when the references were mostly, if not all, written by Western male historians and our archivists? So those are two separate questions from an anonymous attendee. Ayun. I think it's a good question, sir.
Yes, it's a difficult question to answer. But I think the first thing that needs to be said is that we have to accept, the prevailing conditions at the time that things were happening, whether in 1521, 1921, or 2021. It's hard to just condemn, diba? I mean, things that happened in the past by saying, they should not have done that. But if we're talking about the present, then of course, it's okay to question. Parang, bakit nga ba itong panel nila ngayong umagang ito puro lalaki yung nagsalita? Bakit walang babae? So sa akin, that's a valid question at this point. And I'm sure there is an explanation, di ba? Pero yung parang for this particular panel, bakit walang babae? Pero kung yung buong conference, di ba, yung 36 speakers ba? Kung 36 speakers, walang babae kahit isa, I think we have a problem. Ay, nawala yung question. Saan napunta? Kasi nasagot na. Wait lang.
It's on the answered section.
Answered part. Okay.
Sorry.
The second question naman, I assume the question is about Filipino children now getting educated about our country with references written mostly by Western male historians. Not so much archivists, historians lang siguro. Mahirap sagutin yan. Parang hindi na naman yata. Or is the question referring to previous references that were written by Western male historians, most likely during the early 20th century, mostly male, mostly Western. Pero I think naman, I think now and towards the end of the 20th century, mas dumami na yung mga Pilipino na nagsusulat, and konti pa rin yung babae pero dumadami na rin sila. So I think that's encouraging. What do I think of Filipino children getting educated this way? Well, we learn. Kumbaga, we pass on what we learn, diba? So, and that's how stereotypes are perpetuated. Diba? Na parang, kasi nung lumalaki ako, lahat ng doktor, puro lalaki. So ang expectation ko, dapat yung anak kong babae, hindi magdo-doktor. Mga parang ganyan, diba? That's how it happens. Pero, slowly, as our children get more role models who are diverse, yun na lang sasabihin ko, whether male, LGBT, tall, short, whatever, all the stereotypes na nakasalamin or whatever, di ba? I think we're moving in the right direction. Yun na lang siguro sabihin ko. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Atatanes. I actually have a follow-up question, and this is questions from me. I really appreciate how you shown to us the Pedro Tavero collection, but this really begs asking: do you think our quincentennial celebrations today, as well as the proceedings, have been greatly influenced by the fourth centennial? And what makes our quincentennial different from the fourth centennial celebrations?
Okay, I'm not sure if the fifth centennial was influenced by the fourth. I mean, I'm not part of the planning committee, and I don't see any direct link. But there might be. I don't know. Maybe they looked at the fourth centennial as a model, pero it's so different already. The times are different. The format is very different. There are certain similarities, and as I was pointing out earlier, parang in some ways nandyan pa rin yan, even yung mga honorifics, di ba, na doctor ganito, attorney ganyan. So we're still Filipinos. Yung sinasabi ni Xiao kanina, totoo lahat yun. So yun na lang. I mean, that's all I can say, because I don't see any direct connection. Yun. And I'm an outsider to the planning committee, so I have no idea how they did this. Yun.
Okay, fair enough. So thank you, Dr. Tatanes. So we have another question, this time coming from Lorenzo Hipolito, and this is directed to Dr. Gerona. Dr. Gerona, do you support the narrative about Enrique collaboration with Humabon that eventually led to the massacre of Spanish crews by the natives of Cebu?
Yeah, actually, it should be, again, we have to put that in the context of our history. Enrique was the one who, in a way, enticed Humabon to join the projected mutiny, planned mutiny of Lapu-Lapu. It has to be remembered that the two were actually at odds with each other, Lapu-Lapu and Humabon. But then there are certain Portuguese sources which suggest that Lapu-Lapu and Humabon were actually brothers-in-law, meaning to say they were actually related earlier, and then there were certain problems that erupted, and therefore they get strains with each other. And when Magellan arrived, Magellan apparently sided with Lapu-Lapu or with Humabon, and there was the war between Magellan, Humabon against Lapu-Lapu. But why is it that Enrique was eventually dragged into this maelstrom, into this problem? The reason is because the successor of Magellan, Duarte Barbosa, supposedly the brother-in-law of Magellan, had castigated Enrique and told Enrique that because Enrique apparently does not want to rise up after the Battle of Mactan, he was wounded on his face. And it says that Duarte Barbosa told him that you think you are already freed because your master is already killed. He said, no, you are still a slave, and therefore you have to follow what I am telling you. And because of this, and he was even called a pero. At that time, the word pero, dog, was actually a very, very offensive term to natives. In fact, the so-called the document in South America said that you are not supposed to use the word dog anymore to a native because it's very, very offensive. And here, Duarte Barbosa used the word dog, or the so-called the leyes de Burgos. Sorry, that's the law. The leyes de Burgos forbid Spaniards from using the word pero to address to the natives. And here, Duarte Barbosa was addressed as pero by Enrique was addressed by Duarte Barbosa as pero, and he was very, very angry by that. And so because of his anger, he went to Humabon and said, "Oh, didn't you know that the Spaniards are actually planning to rob you? They are actually planning to also eventually to strike at you as they did to Lapu-Lapu. So you better strike ahead of them, and therefore you better get hold of the treasures of the ships that they have." And because of this, there was a certain conspiracy between Lapu-Lapu and Humabon, and eventually Lapu-Lapu told Humabon, "If you are going to kill the Spaniards, you are going to I'm going to give you the treasures that I have, and my wife to be and my daughter as your wife." So because of this, Enrique was believed to be instrumental for the massacre in May 1st, 1521 in Cebu, And that's the story. We don't know what happened after that to Enrique.
Thank you. Another question, this time coming from Eva Theodora Season. Her question is, was the colonization mission to the Spice Islands considered a failed mission because of Magellan's landing in the Philippines?
Sorry, Joel, was the
colonization mission to the Spice Islands considered a failed mission because of Magellan's landing in the Philippines?
Yes, definitely. It was a failed mission, and aside from that, the crew of the Trinidad, one of the ships, the surviving ships, were eventually imprisoned. Some of them were actually imprisoned by the Portuguese for 20 years. So imagine the ordeal that they suffered. And only 18 were able to return to Spain out of the 235 or 200 the crew of the Magellan expedition. So it's a resounding failure in terms of its objective. But then, in terms of the resources, it carried substantial amount of spices when it returned the Victoria, when it returned to Spain. And in a way, in terms of the cost of the expedition, it was able to recoup itself in that particular respect.
Thank you, Dr. Herona, for your answer. I have another question from our Q&A section, this time coming from Rose Paz Narvaja Cornista. I think this is directed to Professor Xiao Chua. Professor Xiao, will our education curriculum change the perception of the Philippines being, quote unquote, discovered by Magellan? Or is this being undertaken already? History should focus on the rich and cultural history that existed prior to the visit of Magellan. I think it's a statement by Rose.
Thank you. Curricular review, Joel, is very hard to do. Especially because the bureaucracy, may bureaucracy yan sa Department of Education. Pero we can cut that because we as teachers, despite the fact that there are what we call competencies, we can add already. Kasi kaya nga we do all these webinars That's why we do all these conferences and Zoom and all of that. So that we can include all the learnings that we have in the quincentennial commemorations. But also, in all fairness to the Department of Education, they became active, especially in the since March, in promoting the quincentennial, its events, and a lot of things. And in fact, this Quincentennial International Conference was already promoted to all the teachers of the Department of Education. And the incoming event, Lapu-Lapu ang dato ng Mactan musical on Sunday, in which I was the historical consultant, is also being promoted by the Department of Education to their teachers and students. So let us focus on the little things that we can do. Post about the commemorations, post about the things that you have learned in the conferences. We can use our voice, social media, and I think that is one thing that we can do. And then we talk to the USEX so that we can begin doing more modules about this theme. And by the way, we are releasing the module for the documentary Kahagi and the Santo Niño in connection to the Quincentennial commemorations. The modules will be available and it is in the format of the Department of Education. It was done by Mr. Danilo Lumabas, a DepEd teacher. So please watch out for that. You can use that as well.
Thank you, Professor Xiao. I think we're running out of time, but I just want to really call this question because it's a really, really good one. And I would like to invite our three panelists to, have a take at this. Okay, this last question for this panel comes from Christina Miranda. Ito. Should there be a qualification or differentiation of the heroism of Lapu-Lapu versus that of Rizal, Bonifacio, and other heroes during the Spanish colonial rule, considering the peculiar historical background against which the Battle of Mactan was set, like the Humabon Lapu-Lapu political rivalry? I think the implicit question here is, what does it really take to become a hero? Should there be, differentiations of heroism? Anyone can answer. Yes, Xiao.
Okay, I'll begin. All heroism, and in fact, all personages in our history should be contextualized. Okay? So if we have a topic wherein we're talking about Rizal, then we contextualize Rizal's heroism against his time, vis-a-vis even Bonifacio's heroism. Diba? It can be different. And of course, Lapu-Lapu's heroism, which some people would say irrelevant to the national narrative because it was just a skirmish, a political a rivalry between local political factions. But the problem is, there are also what we call histoire of the longue durée. Meaning, this is a history of consciousness. What does it mean? Even if Filipino heroes lived in different times, you have the frontliner, you have the OFW, you have the World War II guerrilla, the Katipuneros, the propagandists, and our Bagani, they are still held together by the concept of kabayanihan in the Filipino context, which we discuss in other forum, the concept of Bagani. Then with the concept of Bagani, which came from the word bayani or came from the Austronesian word wani, which is selfless service without expecting anything in return. So you fight for your country without expecting anything in return in true service. And if you're going to look at it, all of these people who help their country, whether they're ROS or what we call personages that are known, or they are ordinary people, are bound by this one concept, and that if we emphasize this enough, maybe we will inspire the young to do the same even without dying for their country. In fact, the challenge is ay hindi yung mamatay ng dahil sa iyo, kundi yung mabuhay ng dahil sa iyo. Diba? And with that, hopefully, I'm sorry if I'm being romantic here. I'm always am. We make the world a better place. Diba? So, Miss Universe question.
Thank you, Xiao.
I agree, I agree that heroism has to be contextualized. And I would just like to add maybe a little that our younger viewers can identify with. I think this is something similar to the GOAT question that keeps getting asked, for example, in basketball, tennis. Who is the GOAT? The greatest of all time. Diba? And if we apply it to history, do we say, is it Lapu-Lapu? Is it Jose Rizal? Is it Andres Bonifacio? Lahat yan may context. And in for example, in terms of basketball, medyo iba na yung panahon natin ngayon versus yung time ni Michael Jordan. Iba na yung rules, iba na yung bola, iba yung mga ganon. May parang it's hard to compare. Yun lang. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tutanes. Maybe Professor Herona may also would like to add, or
Joel, I think just a brief note on the end. I think every act is a discourse by itself, I would say. So in the way, as Xiao Chua pointed out, heroism should be taken in context, and Dr. Totanes has also pointed out. And in this particular sense, what I mean by a discourse is it builds up a certain kind of a tradition, a certain kind of our self-identity as a people. Every act of a particular member of our society in a way influences, especially if you are a prominent personality, it influences either for good or for bad. And therefore, if the impact of that becomes an inspiration to others, I think it does not have a material impact to the community. By itself, it's a form of heroism. And that's what probably my take in this particular question.
Thank you, Dr. Herona, and to all of us who have contributed to the discourse on this quincentennial. We have a very lively audience today. So I would like to just summarize and synthesize everything that our speakers have shared to us this morning. To fully appreciate the aims of the quincentennial, it is very important that we understand and widen our perspective by looking at other sources of history. We have learned about the Portuguese sources and their efforts to illuminate the Philippines from Portuguese eyes. We have also seen how a previous generation, 100 years ago, attempted to relive the ideals of the Magellan expedition, as well as understanding the motivations of the Spanish Empire and their strategy to expand their powers in the East. Through this Philippine International Quincentennial Conference, this quincentennial is a great opportunity for us to study the accounts of the past, to explain why things are, and find meaning in our present. And most importantly, to honor the Filipino ancestors that shone like a beacon of light, a beacon of hope to the weary sailors from another faraway land. So with that, we end panel D of the inaugural session of the Philippine International Quincentennial Conference. Thank you very much again to our speakers, Paolo Pinto, PhD from Universidad de Lisboa, Vernon Totanes, PhD from the Ateneo de Manila University Rizal Library, Dr. Danilo Herona from Partido State University, and also to Professor Xiao Chua of the De La Salle University. It is now 12:40 p.m. We're 40 minutes over time, but thank you very much sa lahat po ng ating mga manonood. We invite everyone to catch the last panel of the inaugural session later this evening, this Friday, 22nd of October, from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. The theme for panel E later this evening is Latin America Views the Quincentennial. You can view it on the Facebook pages flashing your screen, or join us here on Zoom on a first-come, first-served basis and register at www.nqc.gov.ph/PIQC. So with that, we end this panel D. This has been your moderator, Joel Aldor from Grupo Kalinangan, a proud member of the Local Historical Committees Network of NHCP. Magandang tanghali sa inyong lahat. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Nice.